Hello, friend. Welcome to sleepy old world. Get comfortable. Tonight, we step inside Buckingham Palace itself, on a single ordinary day near the end of Queen Victoria's reign, and spend it there to discover what the place actually felt like while someone was living inside it. Behind the rooms the outside world already knew about sat hundreds more that almost nobody beyond the household ever entered. Bedrooms warmed by small private fires, sitting rooms the family used the moment no guests were watching, corridors that seemed to belong to an entirely different building once the clock passed midnight, kitchens tucked far away from the dining rooms they fed, and a garden so quiet and so enclosed that stepping into it could make the whole of London feel like it belonged to somewhere else entirely. A guest arriving that evening might pass beneath every bit of ceremony a royal palace is supposed to offer, and then simply spend the rest of the night eating, talking, dressing for dinner, and finally falling asleep inside a building that was, underneath all of it, also somebody's actual home. And the entire time this was happening, a second, quieter world moved around everyone almost without being noticed, holding the whole enormous place together. That is the palace we are visiting tonight. Not the one behind the railings, but the one that actually breathed. Before we go any further, if this kind of history helps you drift off, a like or a subscribe genuinely helps this little channel reach someone else who might need it tonight too. I would love to know where you're listening from right now, so tell me in the comments. Maybe you are somewhere quiet in Florida with the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. Maybe it is already well past midnight where you are, somewhere near Glasgow. I do read every single comment, I promise you that. All right, love, let's go. Buckingham Palace is dark, standing quiet against a London sky that has not yet begun to lighten. Not entirely dark. There is a single lamp burning behind a curtain somewhere on the second floor, but from the street, from the pavement beyond the railings where a lone constable stands with his collar turned up against the cold, the palace looks like exactly what people imagine it to be at 4 a.m, a sleeping monument, a grand stone shape holding its breath. London around it is doing what London does at this hour, a milk cart somewhere off toward Victoria Street, the wet gleam of gas lamps on empty road, fog sitting low over the park the way it does most mornings in this particular decade, thick and a little sour with coal smoke even before anyone has lit a fire. But behind the railings, behind the dark windows, the palace is already awake. Not the part of it anyone outside would recognise as the palace, not the staterooms, not the ballroom, not the long red carpeted hush of the rooms tourists will one day file through, with their hands clasped behind their backs. Those rooms are still black and silent, chairs draped, chandeliers unlit, waiting. The palace that is awake right now is the other one, the one underneath and behind and beside the famous one. A door 2 floors below street level opens onto a stone passage lit by gas jets turned low, and a woman carrying an armful of folded linen walks quickly along it, her shoes making a particular flat sound against the flagstones that she has made so many thousand times she no longer hears it. Somewhere further along that same passage, a kitchen range that has never fully gone cold overnight is being coaxed back up to a working heat. The iron door of it opened, ash raked, coal added, the first low orange glow beginning to climb again after a night of quiet banking. Somewhere above it all, a small brass bell mounted on a board with dozens of others gives a short, sharp jangle. A young woman with an armful of linen is already moving before the sound has finished. The day has begun quietly, the way it always begins in this particular building, long before anyone upstairs has any real reason to suspect it, and it will go on this way, unseen and unhurried, for many hours yet before a single guest ever steps through the grand front doors, before a single candle is lit in a room built to hold a crowd, before anyone standing outside those gates ever suspects how much has already happened behind the stone. There is a particular quality to this exact hour of the morning that repeats itself inside this building every single day of the year, regardless of season, regardless of whatever the coming day happens to hold. The stillness outside never quite matches the activity already underway inside. And anyone stepping through that plain lower door for the first time would likely be startled by the gap between the two, a sleeping city on one side of the stone and a household already fully quietly awake on the other. It has been this way for longer than anyone currently working inside these walls could say with any real certainty, generation after generation of the same careful, unglamorous rhythm repeating itself before dawn, largely unwitnessed, largely unrecorded, and yet entirely essential to everything the day ahead will eventually become, a rhythm so old and so thoroughly practiced that it has, by now, worn its own quiet groove into the very stone of the place, into the worn hollows of the back stairs and the particular creak of a service door that has swung open at exactly this hour for longer than any single person's memory could reach. Queen Victoria wakes, as she nearly always does, a few minutes before anyone comes to wake her. She's done this for so many years that her body no longer needs the small tap on the door, the soft word from the next room. She simply opens her eyes in the grey half-light of her bedroom, lies still for a moment the way most people do, getting her bearings, remembering which day this is, and then she reaches for the small clock on the table beside her bed and holds it close enough to read. It is not yet 7. Her bedroom is not what most people would imagine when they picture a queen's chamber. It is not enormous. It is not cold and marble and echoing. It is, if anything, close to cosy. A fire already burning low and steady in the grate because someone came in and built it up nearly an hour ago while she slept. The curtain still drawn against the last of the darkness outside. The furniture heavy and dark and entirely without the kind of showy gilt a stranger might expect. There are photographs everywhere. On the mantelpiece, on a small table near the window, on the wall beside the bed itself. Dozens of them. Children. Grandchildren. And one face that appears more than any other. A man with dark curling hair and a serious gentle expression. Photographed and painted and sculpted in miniature so many times throughout this room that a visitor unfamiliar with the household might assume correctly that this room belongs to someone still deeply attached to someone no longer living. She does not linger on this thought this morning. She has learned, over the years, when to let herself sit with it, and when to simply move past it and get on with the day, and this particular grey Tuesday calls for the second. She rings. The bell she uses is a small pull beside the bed, connected by wire to a room some distance away where a specific set of ears is always listening for exactly this sound, and within perhaps 90 seconds a soft knock arrives at the door and her dresser enters. Her name, for our purposes tonight, is Mrs. Ainsley, and she has served the Queen in this particular capacity for 11 years, long enough to know, without being told which black dress this is going to be, long enough to have the entire morning sequence, washing, hair, dress, jewellery, worked into a rhythm that requires almost no conversation to complete correctly. Today, like most days, follows that same practiced order. Mrs. Ainsley has already been in the dressing room this last half hour, and everything the Queen will wear today is laid out with the kind of precision that took years to develop into instinct. There is very little decision-making left in it now, not because the Queen has no opinions about her appearance, she genuinely does, but because after so many years of mourning dress, the choices have narrowed themselves down to a small, well-worn set of variations, black silk or black crepe depending on formality, this brooch or that one, the lace cap with the wider border or the narrower one. Small differences that would be invisible to almost anyone outside this room carry real meaning inside it. The washing comes first, water carried up already warmed, poured into a basin on the washstand, a soft cloth, nothing elaborate. The Queen has never been a woman particularly interested in elaborate personal ritual for its own sake. Then the hair, which by this point in her life is more grey than anything else, brushed out and then pinned back into the simple, tightly controlled style she has worn essentially unchanged for decades. The small white lace cap fitted carefully over the crown of it last of all. Then the dress. It takes longer to describe than it does to happen, because Mrs. Ainsley's hands know this work the way a pianist's hands know a piece they have played 1,000 times, hooks and small buttons closing with barely a pause, the fabric settling into place with small tugs and adjustments so minor the Queen barely notices them happening. Black silk this morning, a modest train that will be looped up out of the way for the ordinary business of walking through her own rooms, and over it, Pinned at the collar, a small brooch that was a gift years ago now, and that she wears more days than not. While this happens, the Queen talks, a little, about small things. Whether the fog outside seems likely to lift. Whether a particular grandchild's cold has improved. Mrs. Ainsley answers where an answer is wanted and works quietly, where the task simply calls for steady hands, and this, more than the dressing itself, is the actual skill of the position. Anyone can learn to fasten a row of hooks quickly. Learning to move through an entire routine, water and hair and dress and jewellery, without a single wasted motion or a single missed step. That takes years. By the time the dress is settled and the shoes are on, plain black leather, low-heeled, comfortable rather than fashionable, because comfort has quietly won that particular argument decades ago, the room has grown lighter. Someone has drawn back the curtains without either woman quite noticing it happen, and outside the window London is finally beginning to show itself through the last of the fog, rooftops, a thin ribbon of smoke rising from somewhere beyond the garden wall, the pale colourless sky of an English morning that has not yet decided what kind of day it intends to be. The Queen crosses to her writing desk, a small, plain, well-used piece of furniture that would look entirely at home in any modestly prosperous household in the country, and this, more than the crown jewels locked away elsewhere in this building, more than the staterooms 2 floors below, is in some ways the truest object in the entire palace. It is here that she will spend a significant portion of nearly every day of her life, not receiving ambassadors, not standing beneath chandeliers, sitting at this desk, writing. There is already something waiting for her on it. A red dispatch box sits at the corner of the desk, one of several that will arrive and depart this room over the course of the day, each one locked, each one carrying inside it whatever the government in Westminster believes the sovereign needs to see. Ministers write to her constantly, not letters exactly, more like reports, summaries, drafts of decisions already half made that still require, by long custom and real constitutional weight, her attention and often her opinion. She reads quickly and writes decisively, small firm handwriting covering the margins of documents that will travel back out through the same locked box within the hour, carrying comments that a Prime Minister somewhere across the city will read with considerably more attention than most of his own cabinet colleagues would like to admit. This morning there is also a letter, separate from the official business. In handwriting she recognises immediately and opens first despite herself. A daughter, married into a household on the continent, writing about a grandchild's tooth, a minor illness now past, a small domestic complaint about a servant that has nothing whatsoever to do with the business of nations, and everything to do with the business of being a mother whose children have scattered themselves across half of Europe. She reads it twice. Down 2 floors and along a corridor that no guest of this palace will ever walk through, a very different kind of morning is well underway. The kitchens have been working for close to 2 hours already, not at full pace. That will come later, closer to midday, when the ovens are drawing serious heat and every surface in the room seems to have someone bent over it. But the early work is already substantial. Bread from yesterday's baking is being sliced. A large kettle is coming to the boil for the first of what will be many pots of tea and coffee served throughout this building today, not only to the family upstairs but to secretaries and equerries and pages and the household's own senior staff, all of whom have their own version of breakfast happening in their own rooms according to their own rank. Because rank in this building determines nearly everything, including, quite precisely, where a person is permitted to eat and what they are served while doing it. A kitchen maid, perhaps 19, is scrubbing a large copper pan with a fistful of coarse salt and a rag. Her sleeves pushed up despite the early cold, because copper takes a particular kind of stubborn effort to keep bright, and the head cook has strong opinions about copper that has gone dull. Somewhere behind her, a delivery has just arrived at the service entrance, a cart from one of the palace's regular suppliers, and 2 men are unloading crates of vegetables still faintly damp with morning dirt, counting them off against a list held by a stern-looking woman in a dark dress who is, in the hierarchy of this particular corner of the building, someone whose word on the quality of a cabbage is considered essentially final. This is the part of Buckingham Palace that has no portrait painted of it. No one has ever commissioned a formal image of a kitchen maid scrubbing copper at 7:30 in the morning, and yet, without her, and without perhaps 200 people very much like her scattered through this building right now, none of what happens later today, the dinners, the receptions, the quiet, elegant hum of a household that appears to require no visible effort at all, would be possible. Back upstairs, the news that arrived earlier by messenger has now reached the person who most needs to know about it. A guest expected this evening, a relative of some standing travelling from the continent, has sent word that changed circumstances, a shifted train connection, a wish to avoid arriving too late in the evening, mean the visit will now begin several hours earlier than planned. Not dramatically early, not a crisis by any reasonable measure, but early enough that a room that was to be finished by late afternoon now needs to be finished by early afternoon instead, early enough that a carriage scheduled to meet a particular train now needs to meet an earlier one, early enough that in a household run on the kind of precise, quiet clockwork this one depends on, a small ripple has just been sent through the entire day. The Queen is informed of this over her own breakfast, which by now has arrived on its tray, tea, toast, a little fruit, nothing especially grand. She has never had much appetite for grand breakfasts, and has said so more than once to attendants who occasionally still try, out of habit or hope, to tempt her with more. She receives the news of the changed schedule with the mild, practised calm of a woman who has managed roughly 10,000 mornings very much like this one, gives a brief instruction about which rooms should be checked first, and returns her attention to the letter from her daughter, the one about the grandchild's tooth. Somewhere below her, that single brief instruction is already setting a dozen smaller instructions in motion. A housekeeper is being informed, a particular guest bedroom, already in reasonably good order but not yet finished to the standard expected for this evening, is being moved to the top of a mental list that a moment ago had it comfortably in the middle. Linen that was going to be changed at 3 o'clock will now need to be changed by noon. A fire that was to be lit an hour before the guest's expected arrival will now need to be lit closer to midday and kept carefully fed rather than simply lit and left, because nothing looks worse to an arriving guest than a room that feels as though someone only just remembered they were coming. None of this will be visible later. That is, in the end, the entire point of it. To understand how a building this size manages to function at all, you have to understand that almost nothing in it happens by accident, and almost no one in it does whatever task happens to be nearest. There is a structure here, as rigid in its own way as any regiment, and every person working inside Buckingham Palace occupies a specific place within it, a place that determines not only what they do, but where they are permitted to go, which doors they may use, which staircases, which rooms, and even in some cases, which other members of staff they are expected to speak to, and which they are not. At the top of this structure sit the senior officials of the royal household, men with titles that sound almost military in their formality, responsible for everything from the Queen's official ceremonial life to the running of the household's enormous and complicated finances. Below them, equerries and pages move through the more personal, day-to-day business of royal life, arranging schedules, accompanying the Queen or other family members as required, managing the endless small logistics of a life lived partly in public and partly, carefully, not. Below them again, footmen in their formal livery, valets attending to the gentlemen of the household and its visitors, dressers like Mrs. Ainsley attending to the ladies, housemaids, kitchen staff arranged in their own careful hierarchy from head cook down through the ranks to the youngest kitchen maid, still learning which pan goes where, messengers running notes and instructions between offices too far apart for a single person to manage by voice alone, coachmen and grooms attached to the stables rather than the house itself, but every bit as essential to how the day unfolds. Rank here determines nearly everything, and it does so through channels that would be almost invisible to an outsider. It determines the uniform a person wears, right down to details of braid and button that mean nothing to a casual glance, and everything to anyone trained to read them. It determines which meals a person eats and where, the senior staff dining separately, and rather better than the junior staff, in rooms of their own with their own particular etiquette that mirrors, in a smaller and stranger way, the etiquette practiced upstairs by the family they serve. It determines how close a person is permitted to come to the Queen herself, some staff working within a few feet of her on any given day, others spending entire careers inside this building without ever once being in the same room as her at all. And it determines, perhaps most practically, which doors a person uses. Buckingham Palace, behind its grand public face, is threaded through with a second architecture almost nobody outside its walls knows exists. Narrow staircases tucked behind panels that look, from the staterooms, like simple decorative woodwork, corridors running parallel to the grand ones, but a level below or a few feet to the side, lit not by chandeliers, but by plain gas jets, their walls plain plaster rather than silk or gilt. A housemaid moving from one part of the building to another rarely if ever crosses the grand rooms themselves. She takes the back stairs, the service corridor, the discreet door tucked behind a curtain or a section of panelling that a guest walking past would never think twice about, might not even register as a door at all. This is by design, and it is old design, inherited from generations of great houses before this one, where the entire philosophy of domestic service rested on a single principle. The work should be excellent, and the worker should be invisible. A guest should never see a bed being made. A guest should only ever see a bed already made, the room already warm, the fire already lit, as though the room simply arranged itself out of respect for their arrival. Which brings us to the bells. Every room of any significance in this building, and a great many rooms of no particular significance at all, is connected by a system of wires to a board somewhere in the depths of the building, where dozens of small bells hang in careful rows, each one labelled, each one corresponding to a specific room. Pull the cord in the Queen's dressing room, and a bell rings on that board with a particular, recognisable position, and whoever is nearest, whoever is responsible for that section of the household on this particular morning, is already moving before the sound has finished. It is a remarkably simple piece of technology, and it governs, more than almost anything else in this building, the entire rhythm of the day. A ring here means water is wanted. A ring there means a fire needs tending. A ring in a guest's room, on a day like today when a guest is expected several hours earlier than planned, might mean any number of things, and whoever answers it has learnt, through long practice, to walk in quickly enough to be useful and quietly enough to seem as though they were simply passing by. A housemaid is answering one of these bells right now, in a guest bedroom on the second floor, a room that this morning was in a state of ordinary, unhurried readiness, and this afternoon needs to be in a state of complete polished perfection considerably sooner than anyone had planned for. She strips the bed entirely, though the linen on it is perfectly clean, because the linen that will be used tonight has been pressed specifically for this purpose, and the household standards on this point admit no exceptions. Guest linen is fresh linen, always, without regard for whether the previous set had been used at all. She works quickly, corners tucked with the same crisp, practiced motion she uses on every bed she makes, dozens of them across a working week, and behind her another maid is already laying a fire in the small grate, kneeling on the hearthrug with kindling and a box of matches, coaxing a flame that will need to be tended and fed for hours before this room reaches the particular, gentle warmth that a guest stepping in from a cold carriage will simply take for granted, will never think to wonder about, will simply feel and be grateful for, without ever knowing why the room happened to be exactly the right temperature at exactly the right moment. Laundry, in a household this size, is its own small industry, and the sheer volume of it would surprise most people who have never had to think about where clean sheets actually come from. Sheets, pillowcases, towels by the hundred, tablecloths large enough to cover tables that seat dozens, napkins folded and pressed into shapes that will be undone and refolded again tomorrow, the delicate lace trim on a cap or collar that must be washed separately, by hand, by someone who understands exactly how much pressure old lace can and cannot withstand. Gloves, undergarments, the endless quiet river of fabric that moves constantly through this building and must, every single day, emerge from it clean, pressed, and precisely where it is meant to be. Some of it is washed within the palace itself, in rooms set aside for exactly this purpose. Steam and the smell of soap and starch, women working over tubs and mangles with their sleeves rolled and their faces flushed from the heat. Some of it, the more delicate items, the fine linens and laces belonging directly to the family, receive a more careful, more individual attention, a particular servant whose entire responsibility might be the care of one specific category of garment, understanding its fabric and its history the way a conservator understands a painting. The Queen's own clothing occupies a strange position in all of this. It is, by the standards of fashion, almost defiantly simple. Black silk, black crepe, small variations in trim and cut that would mean nothing to most observers, and everything to Mrs. Ainsley, who has spent 11 years learning to read them, and yet the care that goes into maintaining even this deliberately restrained wardrobe is considerable. The mourning silks require particular handling. The lace of her caps is old and must be treated with real gentleness. Her shoes, plain and low-heeled as they are polished daily with the same devotion a footman brings to a formal court shoe worn only twice a year. Even simplicity, worn by a queen, turns out to require an enormous quiet effort to maintain. Elsewhere in the building, other kinds of objects are receiving their own quiet daily attention. Silver, kept in a room with its own particular lock and its own particular guardian. A man whose entire working life is organized around polishing, counting, and accounting for every piece that leaves that room and every piece that returns to it. Porcelain from services that have been in the family for generations, handled with a caution bordering on reverence, because a single chipped plate from certain sets is not a minor inconvenience, but a genuine, quietly panicked crisis for whoever was responsible for it at the moment it happened. Crystal, catching gaslight in 100 small fractures wherever it sits waiting to be used. Clocks throughout the building, dozens of them, each one wound on its own schedule by a member of staff whose job, in its entirety, is time, making certain that no clock in Buckingham Palace is ever more than a minute or two out of agreement with any other, because a household run on precise timing cannot afford clocks that disagree with each other about what time it actually is. And then there are the paintings, and the furniture, and the countless smaller objects, gifts from foreign courts, pieces inherited across generations, small treasures tucked into cabinets and displayed on mantelpieces throughout rooms that most staff will walk past 1,000 times without ever really looking at them, because familiarity does that to almost anything, even objects that would leave a visitor from outside this building genuinely breathless. Which brings us, gently, to the rooms themselves, because Buckingham Palace at this hour of the morning is a study in contrast that almost nobody gets to see both halves of at once. Walk along the grand staircase right now, its wide, shallow steps rising beneath a glass dome that lets in whatever grey daylight London happens to be offering this particular morning, and you will hear almost nothing, no conversation, no music. Just the faint creak of old wood somewhere, the distant sound of someone's footsteps 2 floors away, carried strangely through a building built, in places, almost like an instrument for sound. The throne room sits empty and dim, its chairs perfectly placed and entirely unoccupied, gilt catching what little light finds its way through curtains not yet fully opened. The white drawing room, the green, the blue, each one silent, each one waiting, dust sheets removed from the furniture only this morning by staff moving quickly and quietly through rooms they know better, in some ways than the family does, because they are the ones who see these rooms every single day in this state, empty and unlit and strangely ordinary, long before anyone else ever sees them the other way. The picture gallery stretches on in cool silence, portraits of people long dead looking down at no one at all. The state dining room holds a table currently bare, its surface gleaming faintly under a thin film of dust that will be attended to later today, chairs pushed neatly against it, entirely unlike the room it will become in a matter of hours, laid with linen and silver and crystal and flowers, alive with candlelight and conversation. The ballroom, largest of them all, is perhaps the strangest of the empty rooms, because it exists almost entirely for occasions, for crowds, for music and movement, and to stand inside it alone at 9 in the morning, floor bare and enormous and silent, chandeliers dark and still overhead, is to feel something close to standing inside an instrument nobody is currently playing. By this evening, some of these rooms will be transformed entirely. Right now, they are simply waiting, and somewhere behind a discreet door connecting this ceremonial world to the working one behind it, someone is already thinking carefully about exactly how and exactly when that transformation is going to happen. Beyond the palace itself, past a stretch of courtyard most visitors never think to wonder about, sits an entire second establishment that runs on its own rhythm and answers to its own hierarchy, the Royal Mews. Here the work started even earlier than it did in the kitchens, because horses do not wait politely for a household to organise itself, and this morning, as every morning, grooms have been in the stables since well before dawn, mucking out stalls, checking hooves, feeding animals whose upkeep is, in its own quiet way, as complicated and demanding as the upkeep of anything happening inside the palace walls. The smell out here is entirely different from the smell of the kitchens or the laundry rooms, straw and horse and leather and the particular sharp cleanliness of harness polish, and the sound is different too, the soft shuffle and stamp of hooves on stone, a low nicker from somewhere down the row, a coachman's low, steady voice talking to an animal that is listening far more closely than most people give horses credit for. Carriages are being checked over this morning with the same careful attention that Mrs. Ainsley gave to the Queen's dress, wheels examined, harness leather inspected for any sign of wear that might cause trouble later, the paintwork wiped down until it holds a deep clean shine. One particular carriage has just had its scheduled use for this afternoon moved forward by several hours, word having travelled down from the household offices the same way it travelled to the kitchens and the linen room, and a coachman who had planned his morning around one set of timings is now quietly reorganising it around another, checking his watch, calculating exactly how much time he has before he needs to be ready at the door with a particular carriage and a particular pair of horses, groomed to the kind of gleaming perfection that a royal errand requires, even when the errand itself is as simple as meeting a train. Deliveries arrive at the palace all day, through a service entrance well away from the grand gates where visitors come and go, and this morning alone has already brought coal by the cartload, firewood stacked and unloaded by men whose backs will ache by the end of the week whether or not anyone upstairs ever thinks about it, crates of vegetables, a delivery of fish packed in ice that must be gotten into the coldest part of the kitchen stores within minutes of arrival, flowers from a supplier who has been sending blooms to this address for years and knows, better than almost anyone, exactly what the household prefers, and exactly how particular certain members of staff can be about a bruised petal or a stem cut at the wrong angle. Wine arrives separately, carried down into cellars managed by someone whose knowledge of what is stored there, what needs decanting and when, is treated with nearly the same seriousness as the silver room upstairs. Laundry supplies, luggage in the case of an arriving guest, carried in through a different door entirely from the one that guest will walk through themselves, so that by the time they step into their room this evening, their belongings will simply already be there, unpacked, arranged, as though they had never travelled at all. Somewhere between all of this constant, practical, unglamorous movement and the grand hush of the staterooms sits the garden, and it is in its own way the strangest space in the entire property. It stretches out behind the palace, several acres of lawn and trees and carefully tended beds, and it is, remarkably, one of the most private pieces of land in the whole of central London. Beyond its walls, the city carries on exactly as it always does, omnibuses and hansom cabs and the endless human traffic of a capital city going about its enormous ordinary business. But inside those walls there is a quiet that feels almost impossible for the middle of a city this size. Birds, wind moving through trees that have stood here for generations, a gardener working a bed of early blooms with the unhurried patience of a man who has been doing this work long enough to know that nothing about a garden can actually be rushed, no matter how important the people are who might eventually walk past it. The Queen sometimes walks here, when the weather allows and the day permits it, and there is something almost startling about the image. A woman whose signature and whose opinion shape the business of an empire spanning a significant portion of the globe, walking slowly along a garden path with her hands folded, stopping to look at a particular flower bed, entirely, briefly, just a woman in a garden. It will not happen today. The morning schedule has already filled itself in unexpected directions, and the afternoon is likely to follow, but the garden waits regardless, patient in the particular way gardens are, indifferent to whether anyone important comes to look at it today or not. Outside the palace gates, London does not know, and largely does not care, about any of this. The omnibuses keep running, The fog, which had begun to lift an hour or two ago, seems to be reconsidering, gathering itself again along the lower streets. A newspaper seller near the corner is calling out headlines to nobody in particular, and a small crowd of the ordinary curious, as there so often is, stands loosely near the railings, hoping for a glimpse of something, anything, that might confirm that a queen genuinely lives behind that stone face and is not simply a name printed in the newspapers they carry. They will likely see nothing today. The palace, from where they stand, looks exactly the way it always looks, calm, composed, entirely unbothered by whatever is actually happening inside it. By late morning, the household has settled into the particular rhythm that carries most days forward. Correspondents continuing to move in and out of the Queen's rooms, household offices humming along with their own quiet business, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, luncheon begins to take shape. It is a smaller meal than dinner, less formal, though very little in this building is ever entirely without formality. The Queen takes hers simply, often with family if any are present in the palace that day, a grandchild perhaps, visiting for reasons that have nothing to do with state business and everything to do with the ordinary pull of family wanting to see family. The conversation at this table, when it happens, tends to be lighter than the conversation of an evening dinner with guests, a grandmother asking about lessons, about a pony, about whatever small concerns fill a child's world, and there is a warmth in these exchanges that a stranger reading only the official record of this reign would likely never expect to find. Below in the kitchens, though, luncheon is really just the calm middle stretch before the day's real culinary effort begins, because the kitchens are already thinking about dinner. They have been thinking about it, in fact, since before breakfast, because a formal meal in this household, particularly one that will now include a guest arriving several hours earlier than planned, does not simply appear on a table through good intentions. It is built hour by hour by a kitchen staff working at a pace that would exhaust most people within the first 30 minutes. The head cook, a formidable presence in this part of the building, whose word on matters of food is treated with something close to the deference given to a senior official upstairs, has already reviewed the evening's proposed menu with the household steward, small adjustments made to account for the earlier arrival. A particular dish that takes longer to prepare moved earlier in the day's schedule, another simplified slightly to buy back the time that change has cost. Underneath her, a small army of cooks and kitchen maids move through their assigned stations with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this exact dance, in one form or another, hundreds of times before. The heat in this room by midday is considerable, ovens working steadily, ranges crowded with pots, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat beginning its long, slow transformation toward the evening's table, and underneath that, sharper and more immediate, the smell of onions and herbs being prepared for sauces that will not be finished for hours yet, but must be started now if they are to reach the particular depth of flavor the head cook considers acceptable. Copper pans move constantly from stove to work table and back, their bright surfaces catching the light in a kitchen that, despite everything else happening in it, is kept remarkably, deliberately clean, because a kitchen this size producing food for a household this important cannot afford to be anything less. There is a specific kind of choreography to a kitchen at full working pace that outsiders rarely appreciate. Dozens of people moving through a relatively confined space, carrying hot pans, sharp knives, heavy trays, somehow never quite colliding, each person's path through the room worn into a kind of muscle memory that lets them move quickly without thinking, because thinking, in a kitchen this busy, slows a person down in exactly the moments they cannot afford to be slow. And all of it, every hour of heat and steam and careful timing, is heading toward a single moment this evening when a footman will carry a dish through a door and set it, silently, effortlessly, in front of a guest who will have no real idea what it took to get there. That, more than almost anything else in this building, is the entire philosophy of the place laid bare. The labour is enormous. The evidence of the labour is meant to be invisible. What arrives at the table should look as though it simply occurred, the way morning occurs, the way weather occurs, entirely without visible cause. Upstairs, meanwhile, preparations of a very different kind are already underway for this evening's dinner, and they involve considerably more than food. The table itself in the state dining room is being set with a precision that takes hours rather than minutes. Linen laid and smoothed until not a single wrinkle remains visible. Silver counted out from the room where it is kept under lock, each piece checked, each piece polished if the smallest tarnish is detected. Arranged according to a seating plan that has already been quietly adjusted twice today to account for the guests' earlier arrival and the corresponding shift in who will be seated where. Crystal glasses, several per place setting, each one wiped and checked against the light for the faintest smear. China from a service selected specifically for tonight's occasion, chosen with the same careful consideration a hostess anywhere might give to a best set, except that this particular hostess's best set happens to have a history running back generations and a value that would make most households faint. Flowers arrive from the morning's delivery, already cut and arranged into low centerpieces designed specifically not to obstruct the sight lines across the table, because a beautiful arrangement that blocks a guest's view of the person seated across from them is, in this world, not actually a success. Candles are set into their holders, not yet lit, waiting for the specific hour this evening when a footman will move quietly around the table, lighting each one in turn, the room slowly transforming from ordinary daylight practicality into the particular golden hush that a formal Victorian dinner depends on for half its effect. And through all of it, footmen move in their formal livery, checking details, adjusting a fork by half an inch, standing back to consider the overall effect of the table the way a painter might step back from a canvas, because in a few hours this room will be full, and by then there will be no more opportunity to adjust anything at all. There is a particular skill, rarely discussed and almost never written about, in standing still. The footmen who will serve tonight's dinner will spend a great deal of that dinner doing exactly this, positioned around the edges of the room, near enough to respond instantly to a raised hand or a quiet request, far enough to remain, in the strange etiquette of the era, almost part of the furniture rather than participants in the evening's conversation. It sounds like the easiest task in the entire building. It is not. Standing motionless and alert for an hour, 2 hours, sometimes considerably longer, while remaining ready to move at any instant, takes a particular kind of physical discipline that these men have developed over years, weight balanced evenly, expression pleasant but blank, eyes moving without the head ever seeming to turn, tracking a dozen small details across a room, a glass running low, a dish ready to be cleared, a guest's subtle gesture that means something is wanted, without ever once appearing to be paying attention to any of it at all. Behind this practiced stillness, an enormous amount of quiet coordination continues. Plates arriving from the kitchen along a route designed specifically to minimize how far hot food has to travel before reaching the table, timed so precisely between courses that a guest never experiences the awkward gap of an empty plate sitting too long, nor the equally awkward rush of a new course arriving before the last has properly ended. And when this evening's dinner is finally over, when the family and the guests have moved on to whatever comes after, the staff who served them will have their own meal, considerably later, considerably plainer, in rooms set aside specifically for this purpose. And even here, rank continues to shape everything. Senior staff eat separately from junior staff, in a room of their own with its own particular formality, a hierarchy in miniature that mirrors, with a kind of quiet, unconscious precision, the very hierarchy upstairs that these same people have spent the entire day serving. A head cook does not eat with a kitchen maid. A senior footman does not eat with the youngest hallboy still learning where everything belongs. It is not cruelty exactly, or at least none of them would describe it that way. It is simply how the world of this building has always worked, as fixed and unquestioned as the position of the sun. Around 2 in the afternoon, word reaches the household that the earlier carriage has been sighted approaching the gates. It is not in the end a dramatic arrival. There is no fanfare, no crowd gathered specifically for this moment, only the ordinary business of a carriage pulling through the gates, past the constable who straightens very slightly as it passes, and around toward the entrance where a small, carefully composed group is already waiting, having been informed only 20 minutes earlier that this was now, in fact, happening considerably sooner than anyone had originally planned. The guest, when the carriage door opens, steps down into a scene that looks to them entirely unremarkable. staff waiting at exactly the correct distance, exactly the correct expressions on their faces, a room somewhere above already warmed and ready though it was finished only an hour or two earlier than the original schedule allowed for. Nothing about the moment betrays the small quiet scramble that made it possible. That, again, is the entire point. Luggage disappears through a separate door before the guest has even finished the short walk into the entrance hall, carried by hands that will have it unpacked and arranged in the guest's room with a speed that will seem, later, faintly magical to anyone who has never seen the process happen. A secretary steps forward with the particular blend of warmth and formality this kind of arrival requires, and somewhere upstairs a message has already been sent ahead to inform the Queen that her guest has arrived, several hours earlier than expected, but entirely, seamlessly, on time by every outward appearance. There will be, later in the afternoon, a formal reception of sorts, though nothing on the scale of a full state occasion, simply the particular careful choreography that any audience with the Queen requires, regardless of how familial or informal the underlying relationship might be. A waiting room where the guest sits for a few minutes with the mild, pleasant nervousness that even relatives seem to feel before this particular door opens. A page watching for the correct signal, a specific way of entering the room, a specific depth of bow or curtsy depending on rank and relationship, an etiquette so thoroughly ingrained in everyone who moves through this world that it happens almost without conscious thought, the body simply knowing, the way a dancer's body knows a familiar step, exactly how far to bend and exactly when to straighten again. The Queen receives her guest warmly. Whatever formality governs the shape of the moment, the substance of it, once the door closes and the two of them are alone in a room together, is simply family. An aunt or a cousin or whatever the particular relation happens to be, glad to see a familiar face, curious about news from wherever this guest has travelled from, and for a little while the enormous machinery of the entire building quiets itself down to something much smaller and much more ordinary. Two people talking. It will not stay that way for long. The evening still has a great deal ahead of it, but for this particular quarter of an hour, in this particular room, Buckingham Palace is simply a house where someone has come to visit family, and that, more than any of the grandeur surrounding it, might be the truest thing that happens here all day. The afternoon that follows settles into something quieter, and this too is part of the rhythm few outsiders ever get to see. The Queen returns, for a while, to her private sitting room, a space that has almost nothing in common with the grand rooms downstairs, sharing with them only the same roof and the same walls. It is comfortable in a way that would not look out of place in any well-off household in the country. Deep chairs, more photographs, a fire that has been kept steadily fed all day by staff moving in and out so quietly that a person sitting with her back to the door might genuinely not notice them coming and going. She writes more letters here. She reads, sometimes, though her eyes tire more easily than they once did, and she has never entirely lost her irritation at that particular truth of growing older. Occasionally a grandchild is brought in to see her, briefly, a small formal visit that softens almost immediately into something much less formal once the child realizes that this particular grandmother, whatever else the world says about her, is fundamentally delighted to see them. Music enters the afternoon sometimes too, in one form or another. The Queen has always had a genuine feeling for it, not the polite, dutiful appreciation that court life often demands of people regardless of their actual taste, but something closer to real pleasure, and on an afternoon like this one, with family visiting and no pressing state business demanding her immediate attention, there is time for a little of it. Perhaps a grandchild plays something learned recently and imperfectly, and she listens with far more patience and warmth than the performance strictly earns, because patience and warmth, in this particular relationship, matter considerably more than technical accuracy. Perhaps, later, there is something more accomplished, a piece she has always been fond of, filling the room for a few minutes with something that has nothing whatsoever to do with correspondence or ministers, or the endless quiet weight of being who she is. Outside this room, the rest of the household continues its own afternoon business, largely unconnected to whatever is happening in the Queen's private apartments. Correspondence keeps arriving and departing. A page carries a message from one office to another. In the kitchens, the afternoon has become, if anything, busier than the morning. The evening's dinner now close enough that every dish on the menu is somewhere in active preparation. Sauces reduced to their final consistency. Meat basted and checked and basted again, the head cook moving between stations with an expression of fierce concentration that junior staff have learned, through hard experience, not to interrupt unless it is genuinely necessary. Somewhere around 4 o'clock, the light outside begins its slow autumn or winter retreat, depending on the season, and lamps throughout the building begin, one by one, to be lit. This is its own small daily operation, staff moving room to room with the particular tools of the task, and it marks, more reliably than any clock, the shift from afternoon into evening, from the day's business into the day's performance. Because evening, in a household like this one, is when the performance truly begins, and the preparation for it, already well underway, now accelerates into its final and most demanding stage. In the Queen's dressing room, Mrs. Ainsley has laid out a different black gown from this morning's, more formal, the silk slightly richer, the trim slightly more considered, appropriate for a family dinner that will nonetheless carry the weight of formality this household applies to nearly everything. Jewellery has been selected, more of it than the single brooch worn this morning, pieces chosen with the same quiet deliberation as everything else in this building, each one carrying its own history, its own particular weight of memory and meaning that only the Queen herself, and perhaps Mrs. Ainsley, after 11 years of close attendance, could fully explain. Elsewhere in the household, similar preparations are unfolding on a much larger scale. Footmen are dressing in their formal evening livery, brushed and immaculate, every button checked. Uniforms with their particular decorations are being laid out for members of the household whose evening role requires them. Flowers already arranged this morning are being checked once more for freshness before the dining room's final transformation. Lighting throughout the ground floor staterooms is being tested and adjusted. Gas jets and, in certain rooms now fitted for it, the newer electric lighting that the household has begun cautiously introducing alongside the old, a small quiet revolution happening room by room that most guests, dazzled by candlelight and crystal, will never think to notice at all. The guest list for tonight, already settled days ago but adjusted slightly this afternoon to account for the day's small changes, has been finalised, and with it the seating plan, a document that carries far more weight in this world than its plain appearance would suggest. Precedence and relationship and old half-forgotten grievances all factored carefully into who sits where, a puzzle solved by a household secretary with the kind of patient attention most people reserve for matters of considerably greater apparent importance. And slowly, gradually, room by room, the entire enormous machinery of Buckingham Palace begins turning itself, quietly and almost invisibly, from a private household going about its private business into the public face of a monarchy about to receive its evening guests. It is worth pausing here, for a moment, on the quieter mechanics of a building this size, the things that make it possible for so many people to live and work inside it at once without the entire arrangement grinding to a halt under its own weight. Heat is perhaps the largest and most constant of these problems. A house of this scale, with rooms this large and ceilings this high, loses warmth constantly to the London air outside, and keeping it merely comfortable, let alone genuinely warm, requires a small army of fires lit and tended throughout the day in dozens of separate grates, each one needing coal carried up from below, ash carried back down, the whole cycle repeating itself every few hours in room after room after room. The newer parts of the building have begun to see other kinds of heating tested alongside the old open fires, and there is a kind of quiet ongoing negotiation happening throughout the household between the comfort of tradition and the promise of modern improvement, a negotiation that shows no sign of resolving itself quickly. Water presents its own version of the same problem. Hot water for washing does not simply appear from a tap the way it might in a household built decades later. Much of it is still carried, jug by jug, up staircases and along corridors by housemaids whose arms and shoulders bear the quiet daily cost of this labour in ways nobody upstairs is ever meant to think about. Baths, where they are taken, Particularly the full baths in the dedicated bathing rooms are their own small production, water heated below and carried up, poured, tested, topped up as needed, an operation involving several people and a fair amount of time for what a later century will consider the simplest, most unremarkable act imaginable, turning a tap and stepping into a full and steaming tub. Plumbing throughout the building exists in a strange halfway state common to grand houses of this particular era, some of it genuinely modern, some of it still relying on methods that would have been familiar to servants working in this same building decades earlier. The bell system, wired throughout nearly every important room, represents in its own way the most successful piece of household technology this palace has. Simple, reliable, and entirely dependent, in the end not on any mechanism but on the people listening at the other end of the wire, ready to move the instant a small brass bell gives its short, sharp ring. Lighting, too, is caught between two eras. Gas jets still light most of the building, their particular warm, slightly unsteady glow visible in nearly every corridor and room, but certain spaces, chosen carefully, have begun to see the newer electric lighting installed, a change met inside the household with a mixture that ranges from genuine enthusiasm to deep, quiet suspicion. Older staff sometimes muttering that the old gas light was perfectly good enough, thank you, and had served the household well enough for years before anyone felt the need to change it. None of this, the fires and the water and the wiring and the careful daily maintenance of an aging, enormous, constantly evolving building, is ever visible to a guest arriving this evening. They will simply feel a warm room, they will simply see a lit hallway, they will simply turn on a tap in the rooms where taps now exist, and water will simply come, and none of them will spend even a passing thought on the person who carried coal up 4 flights of stairs 3 separate times today to make sure that particular warmth was waiting for them when they arrived. Let me tell you a little about one of these people specifically, because it is easy, telling a story like this one, to speak of servants and staff and household hierarchy as though they were simply categories, functions, roles, rather than actual people living actual lives inside this building. The housemaid who laid the fire in the guest's room earlier today, the one whose name we have not yet mentioned, is called Susan, and she is 22 years old, and she has worked at Buckingham Palace for just over 3 years, having come to the position through a recommendation from a housekeeper at a much smaller establishment where she worked previously, a country house perhaps a third the size of this one, where she first learnt the particular skills that eventually brought her here. She shares a room, small but her own, with another housemaid closer to her own age, and the two of them have become, over the years, something close to real friends, the kind of friendship that grows specifically out of shared exhaustion and shared small triumphs, a particularly difficult stain finally removed from a carpet, a fire that catches on the first try on a cold morning when nothing seems to want to light. Susan rises before 5 most mornings and rarely finishes her work before 9 at night, and the wages she earns for this, modest by any measure beyond the standards of domestic service itself, are nonetheless sent home in careful, regular portions to a family in a village some distance from London, a mother and 2 younger siblings who depend in part on money earned by a young woman polishing grates and carrying linen through the corridors of a building she has never once, in 3 years, walked through the front of. She does not resent this particularly, or at least she has never said so to anyone, including herself in the quiet moments before sleep when a person's honest feelings tend to surface whether invited or not. It is simply the shape her life has taken, and within that shape she has found small satisfactions, a fire well laid, a room set exactly right, the quiet pride of knowing that whatever a guest experiences tonight in that particular bedroom, warmth and comfort and the sense of having been genuinely, thoughtfully looked after, exists because of work she did with her own 2 hands, work that guest will never know her name for, work that will nonetheless outlast, in its small quiet way, whatever brief impression the guest's visit leaves on the household's memory. This is, in the end, the actual human material this entire building is built from. Not marble, not gilt. People like Susan, thousands of them across the decades this palace has stood, doing careful, invisible work so that a much smaller number of people can move through rooms that feel, to them, effortlessly, magically comfortable. By 7 in the evening, The transformation the household has been quietly building toward all day is essentially complete. The staterooms that stood dark and silent this morning are now fully alive with light, candles burning steadily in their holders, the newer electric fittings glowing in the rooms that have them, gas jets turned up throughout the rest of the building to their full warm brightness. The state dining room, bare and dusty at 9 this morning, is now laid with a precision that took the better part of the day to achieve, white linen catching the candlelight, silver gleaming, crystal glasses standing in careful rows waiting to be filled, flowers arranged low enough not to block a single sightline across the table. Footmen stand ready near the doors, immaculate in their evening livery, their earlier day of checking shoes and polishing silver and standing in for last-minute rehearsals of exactly this moment now entirely behind them, replaced by the calm, alert stillness that will carry them through the next several hours. Outside, carriages begin arriving at the main entrance, one after another at carefully spaced intervals that some unseen household hand has clearly arranged, because nothing about this evening happens by accident, including the timing of arrivals. Guests step down into light and warmth, and the particular hush of a building that has spent an entire day preparing for exactly this moment, greeted by staff positioned with an ease that gives no real hint of the frantic, careful choreography that made this ease possible. They are announced, one by one, moving through rooms toward wherever this evening's gathering will assemble before dinner itself begins, and the household's guest, the one who arrived so many hours earlier than planned, is here too, dressed now for the formal evening ahead, the earlier scramble to prepare a room several hours ahead of schedule now entirely, invisibly resolved, nothing left of it but a room that looks and feels exactly as though it had been ready for days. Queen Victoria enters the gathering in the particular way she always does, a presence that draws every eye in the room without any obvious effort on her part to draw it, dressed in her evening black, jewellery chosen this afternoon by Mrs. Ainsley now catching the candlelight with each small movement. She greets her guests with the mixture of formality and genuine warmth that defines nearly every social interaction of her later years. A queen and a grandmother and an aunt and a hostess, all 4 roles occupying the same body at the same moment, without any apparent contradiction, because by this point in her life she has had decades of practice holding all of them at once. Dinner itself unfolds the way dinner in this building always unfolds, course following course at intervals timed precisely enough that no guest ever experiences the slightest awkward gap or rush, footmen moving with their practiced, near-silent efficiency, dishes arriving that represent, each one, hours of careful work in a kitchen 2 floors below that none of these guests will ever see or think about. The head cook's sauces, reduced all afternoon to their final rich consistency, appear on the table with no visible evidence of the hours behind them. The meat, roasted and basted and rested with such careful attention, is carved and served with an ease that erases entirely the labour of getting it to this exact state. Conversation moves around the table in the particular currents such evenings always develop, some of it genuinely warm and personal between family members who have known each other for decades, some of it more formal, the careful diplomatic small talk that any gathering including guests beyond the immediate family requires. The Queen participates in both registers with the same practiced ease she brings to nearly everything by this stage of her life, occasionally sharp with an opinion, occasionally softened by a genuine laugh at something a grandchild says. The whole evening moving forward with a rhythm that feels, to everyone seated at that table, entirely natural, entirely unforced, exactly as though this kind of evening simply happens on its own. It does not, of course. It happens because Susan laid a fire this morning several hours ahead of the original schedule. It happens because a coachman recalculated an entire afternoon's timing around a changed train. It happens because a head cook spent the whole day moving between stations with fierce, unbroken concentration, because a footman spent an hour standing motionless and alert near a doorway, because Mrs. Ainsley chose exactly the right brooch from a small collection carrying decades of memory inside it, because dozens of people whose names will never appear in any account of this evening did their work quietly, carefully, and completely, so that everyone seated at this table could simply enjoy an effortless dinner without ever once wondering how it came to be that way. After dinner, the gathering moves, as it nearly always does, into one of the drawing rooms, and the whole tenor of the evening softens slightly, formality loosening at the edges the way it tends to once a meal has been shared and the harder work of a first impression for those guests meeting each other for the first time has already been accomplished. Coffee is brought in, and tea for those who prefer it, carried on trays by footmen whose evening is by no means over, but who move now with a slightly different rhythm than the tightly choreographed service of the dining room. Something a little more relaxed, though relaxed is always a relative term in a room where the Queen herself is present. Small groups form and reform around the room, the way they do at any gathering, conversation drifting between topics, with a particular meandering logic of people who are, for the moment, in no hurry to be anywhere else. Someone suggests cards, and a table is arranged, and for a while the room holds that particular quiet concentration that card games produce, punctuated by small bursts of conversation or laughter when a hand goes unexpectedly well or badly. Elsewhere in the same room, a different conversation continues at a different pace, 2 or 3 people talking quietly near the fire about something that has nothing to do with the game at all, a piece of family news, an opinion about a recent piece of writing, the small ordinary currency of people who know each other well enough to talk about nothing in particular for the sheer pleasure of talking. At some point, as so often happens on evenings like this one, someone moves toward the piano, and the Queen, watching from her chair with the particular attention she has always reserved for music, allows herself to simply listen for a while, the conversation around her continuing at a lower register, respectful of the music, without feeling obligated to stop entirely for it. Her feeling for music has never really left her, whatever else the decades have taken or changed. It was there in her younger years, long before any of the losses that have shaped so much of her later life, and it remains now one of the few pleasures that seems to arrive entirely uncomplicated, without the weight that so many other parts of her life carry. She has strong opinions about performance, has always had them, and will occasionally offer a quiet comment afterward, a compliment or a gentle observation that carries considerably more weight with the person who receives it than she perhaps realizes, because a word of genuine praise from this particular woman, however quietly delivered, tends to be remembered for a very long time by whoever receives it. The evening continues this way for a while, drifting rather than progressing, the particular unhurried rhythm of a family gathering that happens to be taking place inside one of the most famous buildings in the world, a fact that everyone in the room is of course perfectly aware of, and that none of them by this point in the evening is thinking about very much at all. That in its own way is a kind of success too, the enormous formal weight of the setting having gradually dissolved, over the course of a shared meal and a shared evening, into something closer to ordinary comfort. Gradually, though, the evening begins to wind down, the way evenings do, someone glancing at a clock, a slight shift in energy around the room that signals, without anyone needing to announce it, that the gathering is nearing its natural end. The guest who arrived so many hours earlier than planned this afternoon will retire soon to the room that was finished in such a hurry, and will sleep tonight, most likely, without the faintest idea of the small quiet crisis that room represented for a handful of hours earlier today. The Queen herself begins, in the particular unhurried way she has, to signal that her own evening is drawing to its close. There is no dramatic announcement of this, it is simply understood, communicated through small cues that everyone present has learnt to read, a slight change in posture, a particular tone entering her voice, and gradually the room begins to reorganize itself around the reality that the evening's most important participant is preparing to leave it. Let me tell you a little now about someone else moving quietly through this evening, because the dining room tonight, for all its careful stillness, is full of people whose own private histories are just as real as the Queen's, even if history itself has never troubled to record them. One of the footmen who served tonight's dinner, standing for most of the evening near the far door, with the particular disciplined patience the role requires, is a man named Thomas, 28 years old, tall in the way that footmen are so often specifically chosen to be tall, a certain uniform height, and bearing among the household's footmen, having become, over the decades, something close to an unspoken requirement, men selected in part for how well they will look standing in matched pairs on either side of a doorway, He has been in service since he was 15, starting as little more than a boy carrying coal and running errands in a household considerably smaller than this one, working his way up through positions and households over more than a decade until a recommendation and no small amount of good fortune brought him here 4 years ago. He is, by the standards of his own world, doing well. The wages are good, considerably better than most positions in domestic service outside a handful of the grandest households in the country, and there is a certain quiet prestige within the world he moves in to being able to say that one serves at Buckingham Palace, even if the actual daily reality of the work is considerably less glamorous than the phrase suggests to outsiders. He sends money home too, like Susan, to a father whose health has not been what it once was, and there is a particular satisfaction in that, a feeling of having become, through this strange and demanding and often exhausting work, someone capable of genuinely helping the people who raised him. Standing near that door tonight, watching the room without appearing to watch it, he thinks about almost nothing beyond the immediate task in front of him, a glass that needs refilling, a plate ready to be cleared, and this too is part of the skill of the position, a kind of practiced emptying of the mind that leaves room for nothing except the next small, necessary action. It is not an unpleasant way to spend an evening, exactly, though it is not what most people watching him from across the room would imagine his inner experience to be. There is a kind of calm in it, a kind of quiet, if he is honest with himself, that he does not always find in the noisier, more chaotic moments of his life outside these walls. Later tonight, once the guests have retired and the dining room has been cleared and the silver counted and returned to its locked room, Thomas will finally sit down to his own meal, later and plainer than anything served upstairs this evening, in a room with the other senior footmen, where the conversation will be relaxed in a way it can never be while standing at that door, jokes exchanged, small complaints about a particularly demanding moment in the evening's service, the ordinary decompression of people who have spent hours holding themselves carefully still and are finally, blessedly, allowed to relax. This is the part of palace life that almost never makes it into any account of an evening like tonight's, the quiet, human, entirely ordinary lives running underneath the grand occasion. Footmen who are also sons sending money home, housemaids who are also friends sharing a small room and a great deal of exhaustion, a head cook whose fierce concentration in the kitchen this afternoon is balanced, later tonight, by a genuine and well-earned pride at having pulled off a menu adjusted at short notice without a single visible flaw. The palace runs on precision and hierarchy and formality, yes, but underneath all of that it runs, as any large household eventually must, on people, ordinary people, doing extraordinary amounts of careful, invisible work. The Queen withdraws from the drawing-room a little before 11, moving through corridors that have, by this hour, quieted considerably from the busy formal energy of earlier in the evening, though nothing in this building is ever entirely still, not really, not even at this hour. Mrs. Ainsley is waiting in the dressing-room, has been waiting for some time in fact, anticipating correctly, roughly when this particular evening would end, and the undressing that follows is in its way the precise reverse of this morning's careful assembly, each element removed in an order as practised and unhurried as the order in which it was put on. The jewellery comes off first, each piece handled with real care and returned to its case, small clicks of clasps and settings that Mrs. Ainsley could probably manage with her eyes closed after 11 years of exactly this motion. The gown follows, hooks and small buttons released one by one, the fabric lifted carefully away and hung, already in the same fluid motion, on its form in the wardrobe, ready for whatever attention it will need before it is worn again. There is a particular quality to this part of the evening that neither woman has ever quite put into words, though both of them would likely recognize it immediately if described. The formal Queen who moved through the drawing-room this evening, who received her guests and made her small warm comments about the music, and held herself for hours with the particular composed bearing the role requires, is gradually, piece by piece, being set aside along with the gown and the jewellery, and what remains, by the time Mrs. Ainsley helps her into a plain, warm nightgown and begins the last brushing out of her hair for the night, is simply a tired woman in her 70s who has had a long day and is glad, genuinely glad, that it is nearly over. They talk a little during this, quietly, the way they often do at this particular hour, a small unofficial ritual that has developed over their 11 years together, comments about the evening, about a grandchild's remark that made her laugh, about nothing in particular, the easy, quiet conversation of two people who know each other extremely well within the specific, bounded terms their relationship allows for. Mrs. Ainsley knows a great deal about this woman that almost nobody else alive knows, not through any confidence deliberately shared, but simply through the accumulated evidence of 11 years spent in close daily proximity, the moods, the small habits, the particular way grief still surfaces sometimes in the middle of an otherwise ordinary evening, unannounced, present for a moment, and then quietly set aside again, the way so much else in this room gets quietly set aside. Tonight, that particular grief does not surface, or if it does so quietly enough that neither woman feels the need to acknowledge it aloud. The evening has gone well. The unexpected early arrival was managed without incident. The dinner unfolded smoothly. The music was good. A grandchild made her laugh twice. By the standards this particular woman has learned, over a very long life, to measure her days by, it has been a good day, and there is something in her posture as Mrs. Ainsley finishes the last of the hairbrushing that suggests she knows this and is quietly, simply grateful for it. The bed has already been turned down. The fire in the grate fed one final time for the night, and when Mrs. Ainsley finally withdraws with a quiet good night, the room settles into the particular hush of a bedroom belonging to someone about to sleep, firelight moving faintly across the ceiling, the photographs on the mantelpiece, and the walls holding their silent watch as they do every night, the same faces, the same frozen moments, looking down on a room that has seen, across the years, considerably more joy and considerably more sorrow than its plain, comfortable furnishings would ever suggest to a stranger walking in and glancing around. She will read for a little while, most likely a small lamp burning low beside the bed, before finally setting the book aside and allowing herself at last to sleep. Tomorrow will bring its own version of today, its own dispatch boxes and correspondence and small unexpected adjustments to whatever schedule has been carefully planned the night before. But that is tomorrow's business. Tonight, for now, is simply ending, the way it always eventually does, quietly, in a comfortable room, in a house that never entirely stops working, even while its most important resident finally, gratefully, closes her eyes. While all of this has been happening upstairs, the household below has already begun its own long, careful process of closing down the day, and it is, in its way, just as involved as everything that led up to the evening in the first place. The dining room, emptied of its guests some time ago, is now being cleared with the same practiced efficiency that characterized its earlier service. Tablecloths, marked here and there with the small ordinary evidence of a meal well enjoyed, are stripped and gathered for tomorrow's laundry. Silver is collected piece by piece, carried back to the room where it is kept under lock, counted against the same list it was counted against this afternoon before the meal began, because a household of this size and history has learnt, across generations, that careless accounting of valuable silver is a mistake made exactly once by anyone who wishes to keep their position. China is carried to be washed, an enormous quiet undertaking of its own, warm water and careful hands moving through stack after stack of plates that carried only a few hours ago, food that took an entire day to prepare, crystal glasses washed with particular gentleness, dried and checked against the light one final time before being returned to their cabinet to wait for the next occasion that will call them out again. Candles that burned through dinner and the drawing room afterward were extinguished, one by one, room by room, wicks trimmed and wax scraped from holders that will need this attention repeated tomorrow and the day after and every day this household continues to function. Curtains throughout the ground floor state rooms are drawn closed against the London night, a small daily ritual performed by staff moving quietly from window to window, and fires that burned steadily through the evening are checked, some allowed to burn down naturally overnight, others banked carefully to hold a low steady heat until morning, when they will be built back up again by hands very much like Susan's, beginning the entire cycle over. In the kitchens, the day's real work is also, finally, drawing to its close. The head cook, who has been on her feet since before dawn with barely a pause beyond the briefest snatched moments to eat something herself, is finally allowing her shoulders to drop from the fierce, upright concentration she has held all day, Pots are scrubbed, copper pans polished one final time and hung back in their places, the great ranges that provided so much heat and so much steam throughout the day gradually cooling toward the low overnight burn that will keep them ready for tomorrow, rather than letting them go entirely cold. Stores are checked and noted, tomorrow's rough shape of a menu already beginning to form in the back of her mind, because a kitchen this size never really stops thinking about the next meal, even in the exhausted hour after the current one has finally completely ended. Staff throughout the building begin, gradually, to make their way toward their own quarters, some to a late plain meal in the rooms set aside for it. Senior staff separate from junior as always, others directly to bed, exhausted in the particular, satisfied way that comes from a long day of demanding physical work completed well. Susan and her roommate compare notes briefly before sleep, the way they often do, a tired exchange about the day's small triumphs and small frustrations, the guest room finished in time despite the earlier scramble, a stubborn fireplace that finally cooperated after considerable coaxing. Thomas, having finally eaten his own later plainer dinner with the other senior footman, retires to quarters of his own with the particular tired satisfaction of a man who stood still and alert for hours and made it look, to everyone watching, effortless. Elsewhere, in the room this evening's guest is now sleeping in, the room that stood incomplete this morning and was rushed to readiness over the course of a single afternoon. Everything now looks exactly as though it had been prepared for days. The guest, drifting towards sleep in an unfamiliar bed in an enormously famous building, hears, faintly, the particular sounds of a great house settling for the night, a distant door closing somewhere below, footsteps along a corridor that grow fainter and eventually disappear, the soft tick of a clock on the mantelpiece, the occasional low rumble of a carriage passing somewhere beyond the walls on a London street that never entirely goes quiet, and beneath all of it, faintly, the sense, difficult to name precisely, but somehow unmistakable, of being inside a building that is not merely large but genuinely, carefully, attentively cared for, a feeling the guest could not explain if asked, and will likely never think to wonder about, and yet will carry away from this visit regardless, the way a person carries away the memory of having been made, without quite knowing how, to feel entirely at ease. Let us go back for a moment to earlier in the day, because there is a part of the household's daily rhythm we have not yet properly looked at, and it happened, as it so often does, in the late morning, well before the guest's early arrival threw the afternoon's careful timing into its brief, quiet scramble. An audience had been scheduled, a formal one, an official visiting from one of the government departments whose business required, on this particular matter, the Queen's direct attention rather than simply her written comments in the margin of a report. This is a different kind of event entirely from a family visit, governed by a layer of etiquette so precise and so thoroughly rehearsed throughout the household that it functions almost like a piece of theatre performed the same way, with only the smallest variations every single time it happens. The official arrived considerably earlier than his appointed time, as is customary, and was shown into a small waiting room near the Queen's private apartments, a room furnished comfortably but formally, intended to hold a visitor for the 10 or 15 minutes that protocol generally requires before an audience actually begins. He waited there with the particular blend of confidence and quiet nervousness that even experienced officials seem to feel before this door, checking, more than once, the set of his own coat, the position of a decoration pinned to it, running through in his mind the handful of points he intended to raise, though he had rehearsed them so many times already on the journey here that the rehearsal had started to feel almost superstitious, a ritual performed less for its practical usefulness, and more simply because stopping felt riskier than continuing. A page, watching for the correct signal from within the Queen's own rooms, appeared at the waiting room door at precisely the correct moment, no earlier, no later, and led the official through a short sequence of corridors toward the room where the audience would actually take place. The etiquette of entering that room is, in its own way, a small piece of choreography every bit as demanding as anything performed on an actual stage, though considerably less forgiving of a wrong step. A bow, its exact depth calibrated by unspoken but universally understood rules to reflect the visitor's own rank and the formality of the occasion. a pause, allowing the Queen to acknowledge the visitor's presence before any words are exchanged, a conversation conducted standing, in most cases, unless the Queen herself indicates otherwise, its length and its tone entirely dependent on cues she alone controls, because in this particular room, on this particular occasion, she is not merely a person receiving a visitor, but the entire fixed point around which every other movement in the room must orient itself. The substance of what was discussed matters considerably less, for our purposes tonight, than the form of how it was discussed, because the form is what almost nobody outside this world ever gets to properly understand. Every gesture, every pause, every carefully measured word carries weight far beyond its literal content, and the official, walking back out through the same corridors a little over 20 minutes later, felt the particular mixture of relief and quiet exhilaration that seems to be nearly universal among people who have just successfully made their way through an audience of this kind, the sense of having passed some test whose precise criteria were never explicitly stated, and yet whose failure would have been, somehow, immediately and unmistakably obvious. This happens, in one form or another, several times most weeks in this building, officials and ambassadors and visiting dignitaries moving through the same careful sequence, waiting room, page, corridor, bow, conversation, departure, each encounter slightly different in its particulars and almost identical in its underlying shape, a shape so thoroughly rehearsed by everyone involved in maintaining it, the pages and the household secretaries and the Queen herself, that it has become, after so many decades, something closer to instinct than to conscious performance. The page who led that official through the corridors this morning is himself worth pausing on for a moment, because the role he occupies sits in a particular, curious middle position within the household's hierarchy, closer to the family than most staff ever get, and yet still, unmistakably, staff, a distinction that shapes nearly every hour of his working life. His name, for tonight's purposes, is Edward, and he is younger than Thomas the footman, only just past 20, having secured his position through a family connection to someone more senior in the household, the kind of quiet patronage that has always shaped who gets to work inside a building like this one, then and for a long time before. His work involves less of the physical labour that occupies Susan's day, and considerably more of the constant, low-level alertness that occupies Thomas's, watching for signals, anticipating requests, moving between rooms and offices carrying messages too sensitive or too immediate to be trusted to the ordinary channels of written correspondence. There is an equerry above him in the household structure, a more senior figure typically drawn from a military background, whose responsibilities run toward the more formal, more ceremonial aspects of accompanying members of the family on public occasions, arranging the small logistics of a carriage procession or a public appearance with the same careful attention that a housekeeper brings to a guest bedroom, timing and positioning and sequence all calculated in advance and rehearsed where possible, before the actual event ever takes place. Edward watches this man's work closely, hoping in the quiet, ambitious way of any young person early in a demanding career that his own path might eventually lead somewhere similar. For now, though, his day is built from dozens of small tasks strung together across many hours, carrying a note here, waiting outside a door there, escorting a visitor through a sequence of corridors he has walked so many times he could probably do it with his eyes closed. And there is, in this particular kind of work, a strange intimacy with the building itself that develops over time, a knowledge of which corridors are cold in winter and which retain warmth, which doors stick slightly and require a particular firm push, which staircases creak on the third step from the top, in a way that no amount of careful maintenance has ever fully resolved. This knowledge is never written down anywhere. It simply accumulates year by year in the bodies and habits of the people who spend their working lives moving through these spaces, and it disappears almost entirely the moment those people eventually leave. Edward's day-to-day has included, among its dozens of small tasks, carrying word of the changed carriage schedule down to the Mews earlier this afternoon, delivering a note from the household steward to the head cook regarding the evening's adjusted menu, and escorting this morning's official through his audience with the particular calm efficiency that has already begun to earn him a small quiet reputation among the household's more senior staff as someone worth watching, someone who might, in time, rise considerably further than his current position. He will not think about any of this again tonight. By the time his own work finally ends, considerably later than most people outside this building would consider reasonable, he will be thinking about nothing more complicated than his own bed and the particular relief of finally, after a long day spent almost entirely on his feet, being permitted to lie down. Down at the Mews, the coachman who spent part of his afternoon recalculating a carriage's timing around a changed train has a name too, and a history that stretches back considerably further into this particular kind of work than either Susan's or Thomas's or Edward's does. He is called Walter, and he is 51 years old enough to have worked with horses for this household for the better part of 3 decades, starting as a boy barely tall enough to see over a stable door, and rising, gradually, through every position the Mews has to offer, until he now holds one of its senior roles, responsible not only for his own driving, but for training and overseeing several of the younger grooms working beneath him. His hands, when you look closely at them, tell most of this history on their own, broad and weathered and permanently marked by decades of leather and rope, and the particular calluses that come from handling reins for so many years that the motion has become something closer to an extension of his own body than a learned skill. He remembers, though he rarely speaks of it unless asked directly, driving carriages for occasions considerably grander and considerably more solemn than tonight's family dinner, state processions through crowded London streets, the particular tension of managing a team of horses through noise and movement that would unsettle a less experienced animal badly, the responsibility of knowing that whatever chaos surrounds a carriage on an occasion like that, the horses inside its traces must remain perfectly, reliably calm, because the safety of everyone riding behind them depends entirely on it. Today's work was considerably smaller in scale, but no less demanding in its own particular way. A schedule rearranged at short notice, a pair of horses groomed to a standard that would satisfy even the most exacting eye, a carriage checked over wheel by wheel and harness buckle by harness buckle, before it was ever brought round to meet that earlier train. Walter takes a particular quiet pride in work like this, the kind of pride that rarely gets acknowledged by anyone above him in the household's hierarchy, but that sustains itself regardless, built entirely from his own private knowledge that the work was done correctly, that nothing was overlooked, that whatever happened today, the horses and the carriage and the timing were never, at any point, the source of the day's difficulty. He will be up again tomorrow before dawn, as he has been most mornings for 30 years, checking the stables, feeding the horses, beginning the whole careful cycle over, and there is something in the sheer steady repetition of this life, decade after decade, season after season, that he has come to find, if not exactly restful, then at least deeply, reliably familiar, the kind of familiarity that a person can build an entire quiet contentment around, whether or not anyone else ever thinks to notice it. Back inside the palace, in the guest bedroom that occupied so much of the household's attention this afternoon, the finishing touches applied hours ago have held up exactly as intended through the evening. The washstand holds a jug and basin of the household's good plain porcelain, water already changed once this evening in anticipation of the guests' return from dinner, a small folded towel set beside it with the particular crisp precision that Susan brings to nearly everything she touches. A small lamp burns low on the bedside table, its flame steady and gentle, casting just enough light for a person to find their way to bed without needing anything brighter. The fire, lit in such a hurry this afternoon, has burned down now to a warm, steady bed of coals, banked carefully before the household staff finished their evening rounds, enough to hold the room's temperature comfortably through the night, without requiring anyone to return and tend it before morning. Every detail in this room, from the precise fold of the towel to the particular angle of the lamp's wick, represents a decision made by someone, somewhere in this building, over the course of a single unusually compressed afternoon, and every one of those decisions has, by tonight, dissolved completely into the simple, seamless experience of a comfortable room that a tired guest, home from an evening of good food and good company, will barely register at all before falling asleep. There is one more thread of this household's daily life worth sitting with quietly for a moment, and it has nothing to do with schedules or hierarchy or the enormous practical machinery of keeping a building this size running smoothly. Throughout the palace, in rooms both grand and plain, in corridors and private chambers alike, the presence of a man who has been gone now for many years continues to move through this household in small, quiet ways that never entirely disappear. Photographs, as we have already noted, fill the Queen's private rooms in a quantity that would strike a stranger as remarkable, and it is not only the number of them, but the care with which each one is maintained, dusted, kept in its precise place, that speaks to something the household understands without ever needing to discuss it openly. Certain rooms elsewhere in the palace are kept, by long-standing habit rather than any formal instruction anyone can quite remember being given, in a particular arrangement that has not meaningfully changed in years, furniture positioned as it once was, small personal objects left exactly where they were left, a continuity maintained not through mourning exactly, or not only through mourning, but through something closer to a quiet, ongoing companionship with an absence that has simply become, over time, a permanent feature of the household's daily texture. The staff who have served here longest understand this without needing it explained, and it shapes small daily decisions in ways an outsider would likely never notice. A particular routine maintained, a particular object never moved. The Queen's black clothing itself, worn now for so many years that Mrs. Ainsley has stopped thinking of it as unusual at all, exists as its own quiet, constant expression of this same continuing presence, not performed grief, nothing so simple or so temporary as that, but something closer to a permanent fact of the household's daily life, as fixed and unremarkable, by now, as the colour of the walls in a room everyone has long since stopped consciously noticing. It would be a mistake, though, to let this thread define the whole of what this building actually is, day to day, and the Queen herself has never allowed it to define the whole of her own days either, however present it remains beneath the surface of nearly everything else. Today alone has held correspondence and government business, and a grandchild's small triumphant piano performance, and genuine warm laughter at dinner, and real pleasure taken in an evening's music, and all of that sits alongside the quiet continuing presence of what is no longer here, not in contradiction with it, but somehow woven into the same fabric, the way grief and ordinary life so often learn, given enough years to occupy the same rooms without either one fully displacing the other. This is, in its own quiet way, one of the truest things about this particular household, and about the particular woman at its centre. The public record remembers her primarily through the weight of everything else, the decades on a throne, the reach of an empire, the formal portraits and the state occasions, but inside these walls, day after day, what actually fills most of her hours is considerably smaller and considerably more human than any of that. Letters from a daughter about a grandchild's tooth, a comment about the fog, a genuine delight in an evening's music, and beneath all of it, quietly, steadily, present but no longer overwhelming, the continued company of someone whose photograph sits within view of nearly every room she regularly occupies. The head cook, whose fierce concentration has governed the kitchens for most of this day, has a name too, though very few people beyond the household's most senior staff ever use it, most simply addressing her by her title, a formality she has come to regard, after so many years in the position, with something close to genuine pride, rather than the distance it might have felt like earlier in her career. She is called Mrs. Whitfield, though she has never married, the title itself simply the customary form of address for a woman holding this particular senior position in a household kitchen, a small quiet inheritance of tradition from generations of cooks before her, whose marital status, similarly, had nothing whatsoever to do with the honorific attached to their name. She came to this household nearly 20 years ago, already an accomplished cook by the standards of the grand houses she had worked in previously, and has spent every one of those 20 years building the particular, formidable reputation she now holds, a reputation earned entirely through the daily unglamorous accumulation of meals produced correctly, on time, at a standard that satisfies not only the family upstairs but her own considerably more exacting internal judgment. Her authority within the kitchen is close to absolute, and she exercises it with a directness that younger kitchen maids sometimes find intimidating in their first weeks, and come, almost without exception, to deeply respect within their first year, because underneath the sharpness is a genuine, careful attention to teaching, to making certain that everyone working under her actually understands why a sauce is reduced this way rather than that way, why a particular cut of meat wants this specific kind of heat and not another. She has trained, over 2 decades, a considerable number of cooks who have gone on to senior positions of their own in other households, and she carries a quiet, rarely spoken pride in this too, a sense of having built something that extends well beyond the walls of this particular kitchen. Today's adjusted schedule, the guest arriving several hours earlier than planned, and the corresponding scramble to move certain preparations forward, is, by the standards of her career, a relatively minor challenge, the kind of small crisis that happens with enough regularity in a working royal kitchen that she has long since stopped finding it genuinely stressful, though her staff, watching her move through the kitchen this afternoon with that particular fierce concentration, might have assumed otherwise. What actually occupies most of her private attention at moments like these is not anxiety, but something closer to a kind of intense, absorbed focus, the same quality of attention a skilled craftsman brings to a difficult piece of work, entirely present, entirely engaged, with very little room left over for worry. By the time the evening's dinner had been fully served and the last dish carried up from the kitchen, she allowed herself, for the first time all day, to actually sit down, briefly, in a small chair near the kitchen's warmest corner, a cup of tea in her hands, watching her staff move through the final stages of cleaning with the particular satisfied exhaustion of a job completed well. She will review tomorrow's requirements before she finally goes to bed tonight, as she does every night, a habit so deeply ingrained after 20 years that she genuinely could not sleep properly without first running through the shape of the next day's work, and then, finally, she will allow herself to rest, ready to begin the entire demanding cycle again in a few short hours. And Mrs. Ainsley herself, the dresser whose careful, practiced hands have shaped this entire day from its earliest moments, deserves a little more of our attention too, because she has been present throughout nearly every scene we have visited tonight without ever quite stepping fully into the light herself. She came to this position by a path considerably less direct than it might appear from the outside, having spent her earlier years in service to a family of more modest, though still comfortable means, learning the particular skills of dressmaking and hair, and the countless small daily rituals of personal attendance in a household where the standards, while high, were nothing close to what would eventually be expected of her here. Her arrival at the palace, 11 years ago now, came through a recommendation from a former employer who had, by chance, a connection to someone senior within the royal household, and she remembers still, with a clarity that has not dimmed at all despite the years, the particular mixture of excitement and outright terror she felt on her first morning, certain she would somehow fail at a task she had, in truth, already mastered years before, simply because the person she would now be performing it for happened to be the Queen. That fear dissolved gradually over her first months in the position, replaced by something closer to the quiet, practiced confidence that now defines every motion of her hands. She discovered, as most people in her position eventually discover, that the work itself does not fundamentally change based on who is wearing the dress. The hooks still need fastening, the hair still needs pinning. The same careful attention to detail that mattered in her previous position matters here too, simply magnified by the weight of who is standing in front of her. What did take longer to learn, and what she now considers the truest skill of her entire career, was the other part of the role, the reading of moods, the understanding of exactly when to speak, and exactly when silence serves better, the particular emotional attentiveness that no amount of technical skill with a hook and eye can substitute for. She has never married either, though not, as it happens, for lack of opportunity earlier in her life, choosing instead, at a certain point, to devote herself fully to this particular career, and she has never regretted that choice, or at least has never said so to anyone, including herself. There is a fullness to her days that she has come to value deeply, a sense of genuine purpose in work that matters, that is noticed, even if the noticing rarely takes the form of explicit praise. The Queen has, on occasion over the years, said something quietly kind about a particular piece of work, a hairstyle that held up especially well through a long formal occasion, a dress chosen well for a difficult day, and Mrs. Ainsley has carried each one of these small moments of acknowledgement for considerably longer than the moment itself lasted, turning them over privately, treasuring them in the particular way a person treasures rare and genuine recognition from someone whose good opinion actually matters to them. Tonight, having finished the last of her duties for the day, brushing out the Queen's hair one final time, and withdrawing quietly from the bedroom, she makes her own way to her own small room, considerably plainer than anything upstairs but entirely her own, and allows herself, finally, the particular satisfaction of a day's work completed to her own exacting standard. Tomorrow will bring its own version of today, its own small decisions about black silk and lace and which brooch suits which particular occasion, and she will meet it, as she has met every morning for 11 years now, with the same quiet, practiced readiness that has made her, in her own small and largely unrecorded way, one of the most important people in this entire enormous building. It is worth returning briefly to those red dispatch boxes that arrived at the Queen's desk so early this morning, because the business contained inside them touches, in ways easy to overlook amid the day's more domestic concerns, on matters considerably larger than a single household's dinner arrangements. The papers moving through those locked boxes today concerned themselves with the ordinary, continuous business of governing a nation whose interests and obligations stretched, by this point in the century, across a considerable portion of the globe, questions of administration in territories thousands of miles from this desk, reports from ministers on matters of trade and diplomacy, summaries prepared by civil servants whose entire careers were built around distilling enormously complicated questions into a page or two that a monarch with limited hours in her day could reasonably be expected to absorb and respond to. The Queen's engagement with this material was, by every account of those who worked closely with her, considerably more substantial than a purely ceremonial role would require. Her margin notes sharp, her questions pointed, decades of practice having sharpened her sense of which details actually mattered and which were simply padding meant to fill a page. An equerry attached to the household's more formal administrative business spent a portion of his own morning today reviewing correspondence related to an upcoming appointment, a matter of protocol requiring careful attention to precedent, because very little in this world happens without reference to how it was handled the previous time a similar situation arose, a vast unwritten library of custom and precedent that senior household staff carry with them, the way a lawyer carries case law, ready to be consulted at a moment's notice whenever a new situation threatens to require an entirely fresh decision, rather than simply the careful application of an old one. This administrative machinery, running quietly alongside the more visible domestic rhythms of the day, rarely intersects directly with anything a guest at tonight's dinner would ever notice or think about, and yet it occupies a genuinely significant portion of the household's collective daily effort, secretaries and clerks and equerries moving paper and information through channels, every bit as carefully maintained as the channels that move linen and silver and prepared dishes through the building's more domestic passages. Both kinds of work, the administrative and the domestic, ultimately serve the same underlying purpose, keeping this particular life, in all its complexity, running smoothly enough that the woman at its centre can move through her day with something resembling the steady, composed authority the role has always demanded of her. It is difficult to properly hold in mind the actual scale of a household like this one, because the numbers involved, stated plainly, tend to slide past without really landing, the way very large figures so often do. It is easier perhaps to feel the scale through its parts rather than through any single total. Consider that the linen room alone, the one Susan drew this morning's fresh towels and sheets from, holds a quantity of sheets, pillowcases, towels, and tablecloths that would furnish several ordinary households many times over, all of it catalogued, all of it tracked, all of it cycling constantly between use and washing and storage, in a rhythm that never fully stops. Consider that the kitchens, on an ordinary day such as today, prepare not one meal but many, breakfast and luncheon and dinner for the family, separate meals for senior staff, separate meals again for junior staff, each one different in its particulars, each one requiring its own planning and its own execution. Consider the silver room, holding pieces enough to set a formal table for dozens of guests without repeating a single pattern, each piece accounted for, polished, returned. Consider, too, the sheer number of people this single building depends upon to function at all. Footmen and housemaids and kitchen staff and laundry workers and grooms and coachmen and secretaries and clerks and pages and equerries and dressers and valets, a population easily numbering in the hundreds when every department is counted together, each one occupying their own particular place within a hierarchy so detailed and so long established that most of them could recite, without hesitation, exactly who stands above them and exactly who stands below. And consider, finally, that all of this exists to support, in its most immediate and direct sense, the daily life of a single household, a family whose actual daily needs, stripped of ceremony and rank and history, are not fundamentally different from the needs of any family anywhere. They need to be fed, they need clean clothes, they need warm rooms in winter and comfortable rooms in summer, they need their correspondence answered and their guests received. What makes this particular household different is not the nature of these needs, but their scale, and the sheer number of hands required to meet that scale, day after day, without ever once allowing the effort behind it to become visible to the people it serves. The question of lighting, touched on earlier, deserves a little more attention, because it represents one of the few places in this household where the future is visibly, if cautiously, arriving. Gas lighting has served this building reliably for decades by this point, and its particular quality, warm, slightly golden, prone to a faint flicker that most people who grew up with it have long since stopped consciously noticing, has shaped the entire visual character of the palace's interior for as long as anyone currently working here can remember. It requires its own daily maintenance, jets checked and cleaned, mantles replaced when they wear, a household staff member whose responsibilities include ensuring that every fixture throughout the building is working correctly and safely, because gas lighting, for all its familiarity, carries its own quiet risks that nobody in a building this size can afford to grow careless about. Electric lighting, installed carefully in a handful of the more prominent rooms in recent years, offers something genuinely different. A steadier, whiter light that does not flicker, that does not consume the room's air the way gas flame does, that some of the household's more forward-looking staff speak of with real enthusiasm, and others regard with a particular suspicion older people often reserve for any change to a system that has, in their experience, always worked perfectly well before. The installation itself required considerable disruption, wiring run carefully through walls and ceilings by workmen brought in specifically for the purpose. Fixtures chosen to complement rather than clash with the existing decoration of rooms that have, in some cases, looked essentially the same for generations. The Queen herself has expressed opinions on this transition that vary depending, it seems, on her mood and the particular room in question, generally favourable toward the practical benefits, occasionally nostalgic for the softer quality of the old gaslight in rooms where memory attaches itself particularly strongly to how things have always looked. This small ongoing negotiation between old and new plays itself out, in one form or another, throughout nearly every part of the building's daily operation. Plumbing gradually modernized alongside older systems still relied upon out of habit or necessity. Communication methods evolving even as the bell system, simple and reliable, continues to anchor the household's daily rhythm exactly as it has for decades. Buckingham Palace, for all its history and all its tradition, is not in fact a frozen relic. It is a living, working building, quietly absorbing the changes of its own era, even while maintaining, with real deliberate care, the continuities that make it recognizably itself. Return for a moment to the small piano performance mentioned earlier this evening, because it deserves rather more attention than a passing sentence gives it. The grandchild who played, a girl of perhaps 9, had been practicing the piece for several weeks under the careful, patient instruction of a household music tutor, a woman who divided her working life between several rooms in the palace and the considerably more demanding task of coaxing genuine progress out of a talented but easily distracted young student. The piece itself was simple, well within a beginner's grasp, the kind of gentle, uncomplicated melody that exists specifically to build a young player's confidence before asking anything harder of them, and the performance, when it finally happened this evening in the drawing room, was not without its small stumbles, a note reached for and missed, a brief hesitation in the middle of a phrase where memory faltered for a moment before recovering. None of this mattered in the slightest to the room's most important audience member. The Queen watched with an attention considerably more focused than the modest technical difficulty of the piece would seem to warrant, her expression softening in a way that the staff who know her best would recognize immediately as entirely genuine rather than merely polite. And when the final note finished, slightly early, the girl having rushed the ending in her eagerness to simply finish without further mistakes, the applause that followed carried a warmth that had nothing whatsoever to do with the actual quality of the playing, and everything to do with who was doing it. Afterward, the girl was called over and sat for a while on a low stool near her grandmother's chair, answering questions about her lessons, about a pony she was learning to manage on her own for the first time, about a book she had recently finished and enjoyed considerably more than she had expected to. This particular conversation, quiet and entirely ordinary, unfolded in exactly the same drawing room where, only minutes earlier, formal introductions and careful diplomatic small talk had governed the evening's tone, and the shift between the two registers happened so smoothly that nobody in the room seemed to find it remarkable at all. Family simply being family, regardless of whatever grander context happened to surround them at any given moment. This, perhaps more than any single ceremonial detail of the evening, captures something true about the actual daily texture of life inside this building. The grandeur is real and constant and inescapable in its own way, but woven through it, in moments like this one, is something considerably smaller and considerably more universal. A grandmother genuinely delighted by an imperfect piano performance, a granddaughter eager to talk about a pony, two people who happen to occupy an extraordinary set of circumstances, finding, within those circumstances, the same simple pleasure in each other's company that families everywhere, in considerably humbler homes, find in theirs. There is a particular character to the food that appeared on tonight's table worth lingering over a moment longer, because a formal dinner in this household follows its own careful, unhurried architecture, course arriving after course in a sequence designed as much for pacing and pleasure as for simple nourishment. The meal began, as these evenings generally do, with a clear soup, delicate and carefully seasoned, the kind of dish that exists partly to please and partly simply to signal, gently, that the evening's more serious eating is about to begin. Fish followed, prepared with a light sauce that Mrs. Whitfield had been quietly perfecting in various forms for years, adjusted today, as everything today was adjusted, to accommodate the earlier hour without sacrificing any of the care that normally went into it. Then came the meal's more substantial centre, a roasted joint carved with practised precision at a side table by a footman trained specifically in this particular skill, accompanied by vegetables prepared simply enough to let their own flavour carry, rather than being buried under unnecessary elaboration, a philosophy Mrs. Whitfield has held to firmly throughout her entire career, despite occasional pressure from more fashion-conscious quarters of the household to embrace more elaborate continental styles of presentation. Between courses, small pauses allowed conversation to breathe, footmen clearing and resetting with a quiet efficiency that never once made a guest feel rushed toward the next dish before they had properly finished appreciating the last one. Wine moved through the meal in its own careful sequence, different pours for different courses, selected in advance by a member of the household whose knowledge of the palace's substantial cellars rivaled, in its own narrow way, Mrs. Whitfield's knowledge of the kitchen. Dessert arrived last, something light and sweet, the kind of dish meant to close a meal gently rather than overwhelm a palate already well satisfied by everything preceding it, and then coffee, moving the gathering naturally toward its transition into the drawing room and the more relaxed hours that followed. None of this, from the clear soup through to the final coffee, happened by accident or improvisation. Every element had been decided upon, tested, and refined over years of similar evenings, adjusted today only in its timing rather than its substance, a testament to a kitchen so thoroughly practiced in this particular kind of work that even a schedule thrown into disarray by several hours could not meaningfully diminish the quality of what eventually reached the table. The guest whose early arrival set today's small quiet scramble in motion is worth a little more attention too, because she is not simply a plot device around which the household's logistics reorganize themselves for an afternoon, but a person with her own particular reasons for making this journey, her own particular relationship to the family she has come to visit. She is a cousin, somewhat younger than the Queen herself, married into a European royal house whose own customs and rhythms differ in small but noticeable ways from what she encounters on these visits to England. She has made this particular journey many times over the years, enough that the details of it, the crossing, the train, the particular quality of English weather in whatever season she happens to be travelling through, no longer hold any real novelty for her, and yet each visit still carries its own genuine pleasure, a chance to see family scattered by marriage and distance across half the continent, gathered here however briefly in one place. Her decision to arrive earlier than originally planned came from nothing more dramatic than a wish to avoid a particularly inconvenient late connection, a small practical preference that nonetheless, as we have seen, rippled outward through an entire household's carefully planned afternoon. She has no idea, arriving as she does into a room that appears to have been ready for days, that her simple preference for an earlier train produced several hours of genuinely careful, coordinated effort from people she will likely never meet or think about, and there is something almost gently comic in this gap between her own small, ordinary decision and the invisible scale of the response it produced, though nobody in the household would ever describe it to her in quite those terms, and she will simply experience the whole visit as effortlessly, comfortably smooth, exactly as intended. Over dinner this evening, she spoke warmly about her own household, about children now grown and scattered into households of their own, about a garden she has been cultivating with considerably more enthusiasm than success, and the Queen listened and responded with the particular genuine warmth she reserves for exactly this kind of conversation. Two women who have known each other across decades of shared family history, comparing notes on lives that have run, in their broad outlines, remarkably parallel courses despite unfolding in different countries under different flags. Tomorrow she will likely walk in the garden, visit with other family members expected to call during her stay, and eventually, in a few days, make the return journey home, leaving behind, without ever knowing it, the small quiet legacy of having caused an entire palace to move a little faster for one particular afternoon. Return once more to the Mews, because there is a particular carriage among the several kept there that deserves its own moment of attention, the one Walter drove out this afternoon to meet the earlier train. It is not the most elaborate carriage in the collection. That distinction belongs to vehicles reserved for the largest state occasions, gilded and ornate in ways that would seem almost excessive for an ordinary afternoon errand. This particular carriage is instead one of the household's regular working vehicles, handsome without being showy, built for comfort and reliability rather than pure ceremonial display. Its dark paintwork kept to a deep, careful shine through the same daily attention that governs nearly everything else in this building. Its interior is upholstered in a rich, dark fabric, worn just slightly at certain points from years of regular use, comfortable in the particular way that only genuinely good, well-maintained things become comfortable, a quality no amount of money can simply purchase outright, but that develops instead through years of careful, consistent care. The harness fitted to the horses this afternoon carries its own small story of maintenance and craft, leather kept supple through regular oiling, brass fittings polished to a bright shine that catches light even under London's grey afternoon sky, every buckle and strap checked before the carriage ever left the Mews for the particular reason that a piece of failed harness at the wrong moment could mean considerably more than mere inconvenience. Walter's attention to this equipment reflects decades of accumulated experience, an almost instinctive checking and rechecking that happens now largely without conscious thought, his hands simply knowing, through long habit, exactly where to look and exactly what to feel for. The Royal Mews itself, as an institution, carries a history stretching back considerably further than the current buildings that house it. Generations of horses and carriages and the people who cared for them, serving a household whose transportation needs have evolved gradually over that long span, even as the fundamental relationship between coachman and horse and carriage has remained, in its essentials, remarkably unchanged. Walter is simply the current holder of a role that others held before him and others will hold after him, a small link in a chain considerably longer than any single career, and there is something in this continuity, however rarely he consciously thinks about it, that gives his daily work a weight and a meaning that extends well beyond the simple practical task of getting a carriage from one place to another on time. The lace attended to so carefully in the household's laundry rooms deserves its own closer look, because the handling of it represents one of the more specialized, almost artisanal skills quietly practiced within this building's domestic operations. Old lace, the kind that trims the Queen's caps and collars, is fragile in ways that ordinary fabric is not, threads worn thin by years of careful wear and equally careful washing, patterns that took hours of skilled handwork to produce originally and that could be damaged beyond repair by even a single moment of careless handling. The woman responsible for this particular task within the laundry rooms approaches it with a slow, deliberate patience entirely different from the brisker, more efficient rhythm applied to ordinary sheets and towels, lace pieces laid flat rather than wrung, washed in barely warm water with the gentlest possible soap, rinsed with equal care, and then, most delicately of all, pinned out to dry in a particular careful shape that preserves the pattern's original form, rather than allowing it to shrink or distort as it dries. This work takes considerably longer, piece for piece, than almost anything else the laundry rooms handle, and yet it receives no particular acknowledgement beyond the simple fact that it must be done correctly, because a damaged piece of lace worn by the Queen herself would represent not merely an inconvenience, but a small, quiet failure that would reflect, however unfairly, on the entire household's competence. The woman who performs this work has, over years of practice, developed a feel for exactly how much handling any particular piece can withstand, an expertise built entirely from repetition and close attention rather than from any formal training beyond what she learnt from the person who held this responsibility before her. Elsewhere in the same rooms, the more ordinary daily volume of washing continues at its usual considerable pace, sheets and towels and table linen moving through tubs and mangles and drying racks in a steady, unbroken rhythm that never really pauses across an entire working week, steam rising thick in the air, the smell of soap and starch settling into the walls themselves after so many years of exactly this same work being performed in exactly this same space, day after day, season after season, for as long as this particular room has served this particular purpose. The guest bedroom that occupied so much of the household's attention this afternoon deserves, perhaps, one more visit, this time simply to sit inside it for a moment and notice what an arriving guest would actually see, rather than the frantic preparation that preceded their arrival. The room is generously proportioned without being cavernous, wallpapered in a pattern of small restrained flowers that has hung on these particular walls for longer than anyone currently in service could say with certainty, faded just slightly in the places where sunlight through the tall window has reached it most directly over the years. A writing desk sits near that window, stocked with fresh paper and ink in anticipation of correspondence the guest might wish to write during her stay, the household's standard, thoughtful provision for any visitor who might need to send word home or maintain whatever business correspondence their position requires, even while travelling. A small seating area near the fireplace offers a comfortable chair and a low table arranged to catch both the warmth of the fire and whatever daylight the tall window admits. The bed itself, the object of so much of Susan's careful attention this afternoon, is dressed now in linen so crisp and so carefully pressed that it holds its shape almost like paper, a heavy coverlet folded back in the particular manner the household considers correct, pillows arranged with a precision that a guest settling in for the night would likely never consciously notice, only feel, in the vague, comfortable way a person feels that a bed has been properly, thoughtfully made, rather than simply assembled. A small vase of flowers sits on the mantelpiece, chosen from this morning's delivery and arranged by hands practiced enough to make the task look effortless, and beside it, a clock, wound and set correctly this morning, along with every other clock in the building, ticking quietly through the empty afternoon hours before the room's occupant arrived to hear it. The window looks out over a section of the garden, bare branches this evening against a darkening sky, though in warmer months this same view offers considerably more colour and life, a small private detail of the room's character that changes with the seasons the way so much else in this building does, quietly, reliably, without anyone needing to remark upon it. By the time the guest returned to this room after dinner tonight, tired and pleasantly full and ready for sleep, every element of it had settled into exactly the kind of unremarkable, comfortable readiness that represents the household's highest and most difficult achievement, a room that reveals nothing at all of the effort required to prepare it, offering instead only the simple, quiet experience of having been thoughtfully, completely looked after. Earlier in the afternoon, before the evening's formal transformation began, the drawing room served a considerably more relaxed purpose than the one they would later hold, and it is worth pausing on that quieter version of these spaces before returning to the grander occasion that eventually filled them. The white drawing room in particular saw an hour or so of genuinely informal family use before the day's more ceremonial business resumed. Several family members gathered loosely near the windows where the afternoon's grey light fell most generously, conversation drifting easily between topics without any particular structure or agenda. A newspaper passed from hand to hand, a small dispute over a piece of family news settled with the particular good-humoured bickering that only people who have known each other their entire lives can manage without any real heat behind it. The green drawing room, smaller and somewhat cosier in feeling despite its considerable size by ordinary domestic standards, held its own brief afternoon life too, a pair of grandchildren occupying a corner of it, with a card game that seemed to involve rules invented and revised more or less continuously as they played, their occasional bursts of laughter carrying faintly into the corridor outside, where a passing housemaid, catching the sound, allowed herself a small private smile before continuing on with whatever task had brought her that way. The blue drawing room, by contrast, saw somewhat less use this particular afternoon, its formality perhaps slightly less suited to casual family gathering than its neighbouring rooms, though it too had been dusted and aired and prepared that morning, along with every other room in this section of the palace, ready regardless of whether anyone actually chose to use it today. By early evening, all three rooms had been quietly reset, cushions straightened, newspapers cleared away, the loose, comfortable disorder of an ordinary family afternoon smoothed back into the careful formal arrangement expected of rooms about to receive guests, and this transition, like so many others throughout this building's daily rhythm, happened almost entirely without anyone upstairs noticing it happening, the rooms simply appearing, by the time guests began arriving for the evening, exactly as formal and exactly as composed as they were always expected to be, the earlier afternoon's relaxed family life folded away and put aside as completely and as invisibly as the linen that had been changed in the guests' bedrooms several hours earlier. There is a particular rhythm to how the Queen's relationship with her grandchildren has settled itself over the years, and it is worth lingering on a little longer than we have so far, because it occupies a considerably larger portion of her actual daily experience than most formal accounts of her reign ever bother to mention. By this point in her life, the number of grandchildren scattered across her extended family has grown considerable, some living close enough in England to visit with real regularity, others settled abroad through marriage into various European royal houses, their visits necessarily rarer and therefore, in their own way, more eagerly anticipated when they do happen. She keeps track of each of them with a specificity that would surprise anyone who imagines a woman of her age and position too occupied with matters of state to hold the small particular details of dozens of young lives in her head at once. Which child has recently taken up a new instrument, which has struggled with a tutor, which has shown an early talent for languages or drawing, or, in one case she finds particularly amusing, an apparently inexhaustible enthusiasm for horses that no amount of parental redirection has managed to dampen in the slightest. Letters move constantly between her and these scattered grandchildren, in addition to the letters exchanged with their parents, small notes of encouragement or gentle correction, questions about their studies, comments on photographs sent to her that now join the considerable collection already covering nearly every available surface in her private rooms. She has over the years developed a reputation within the family for a kind of watchful, opinionated affection, warm but rarely uncritical, quick to praise genuine effort and equally quick to note, in her own quiet way, where she believes more effort might be warranted. Today's visit from the piano-playing granddaughter and her brief, warm exchange in the drawing room represents in miniature the texture of dozens of similar small interactions that fill the Queen's days far more consistently than any single dramatic state occasion ever could. The empire she governs, in whatever formal constitutional sense the word applies, occupies a considerable portion of her working hours. The dispatch boxes and the correspondence and the careful practiced diplomacy of formal audiences, but the family she has built and continues actively, attentively building through these small daily exchanges of letters and visits and quiet watchful affection, occupies something closer to the emotional center of her actual daily experience, however rarely that particular truth makes its way into the formal historical record of her reign. The pantries and storerooms that support the kitchens deserve a little more attention too, because they represent their own particular kind of quiet, careful management, considerably less visible even than the kitchens themselves, and yet no less essential to how this entire household actually functions. Deep within the service areas of the building, a series of rooms holds the accumulated provisions that make the kitchen's daily work possible, dry stores of flour and sugar, and the countless smaller ingredients that never appear directly on a dinner table, but without which nothing on that table could ever be produced. Sacks and tins and jars, arranged with the same careful, methodical order that governs the silver room and the linen room, each item tracked, each item accounted for by a member of staff whose entire responsibility centers on knowing, at any given moment, exactly what the household has on hand and exactly what will need to be ordered before a shortage becomes an actual problem. Cooler stores hold meat and fish and dairy, managed with particular care given how quickly such provisions can spoil if handled carelessly, deliveries timed and inspected with real rigor before anything is accepted into the household stores at all, because the head cook's exacting standards extend well beyond her own kitchen work into every ingredient that enters the building in the first place. The wine cellars mentioned earlier hold their own considerable inventory, bottles laid down years in advance for occasions not yet even planned, a slow, patient accumulation that requires an entirely different kind of management than the kitchen's more immediate daily concerns. This entire network of storage and supply operates on its own quiet rhythm, deliveries arriving on their scheduled days, stores checked and rotated to ensure nothing sits forgotten and eventually spoiled, a constant careful balancing of having enough on hand to meet whatever the household's needs happen to be on any given day, including days like today, when a schedule shifts suddenly and demands adjustment, without ever holding so much surplus that waste becomes its own quiet problem. It is unglamorous work, entirely invisible to anyone above stairs, and yet a single serious failure in this particular corner of the household's operation, a shortage discovered too late, a delivery missed or mishandled, could disrupt the smooth appearance of the entire building's daily life considerably more severely than almost anything else that might go wrong on an ordinary working day. Consider too the particular quiet skill involved in managing the flow of visitors through this building on an ordinary working day, because today, beyond the government official's formal audience and the family guest's early arrival, several other smaller comings and goings passed through the palace's various entrances without ever rising to the level of anything requiring special notice. A tradesman arrived mid-morning to attend to a small repair in one of the household's clocks, admitted through a service entrance, escorted by a member of staff familiar enough with the building's layout to guide him efficiently to the room in question, and back out again, without either of them ever crossing paths with anyone from the family. A messenger from one of the government offices delivered a further piece of correspondence in the early afternoon, received at a side door by a footman who knew, from long practice, exactly which internal office to carry it to without needing to ask. A small delivery of new sheet music arrived for the household's music tutor, unremarkable in itself, but part of the same continuous, largely invisible traffic of goods and people moving through this building's various entrances throughout every single working day. Each of these small interactions required its own tiny piece of household coordination, someone to answer the door, someone to verify the visitor's business, someone to escort them to wherever they needed to go and see them safely back out again, and the staff responsible for managing this constant flow. Senior footmen and porters stationed at the building's various entrances throughout the day perform this work with a practiced, unhurried efficiency that mirrors in its own smaller way the same careful, invisible competence that characterizes nearly every other department of this household's operation. There is a particular philosophy embedded in how this building manages its various entrances and the different categories of people who pass through them. Family and honoured guests through the grand front approach, tradesmen and deliveries through service entrances well away from any space a guest might see, government business through its own separate channels entirely, each category of person and purpose kept carefully, deliberately separate from the others, so that the experience of moving through this building varies enormously depending on which door a person happens to enter through, and depending, ultimately, on where they fall within the vast, largely unspoken hierarchy that shapes nearly every aspect of daily life inside Buckingham Palace. Beyond the household staff themselves, another category of person moves through the daily life of this building, with its own particular rhythm and its own particular relationship to the family it protects, the guards whose presence, so constant as to become almost invisible to anyone who works here regularly, marks the palace's perimeter and its more sensitive internal points throughout every hour of the day and night. Their duty today has unfolded much as it does most days, a steady rotation of postings at the gates and at certain points within the building itself, each shift relieved by the next with a punctuality that mirrors, in its own formal military way, the same reliable precision that governs so much else in this household's operation. The soldier who stood at the main gate through the cold hours before dawn this morning, watching the milk cart pass and the fog settle low over the street, was relieved some hours ago by a colleague who has, in turn, already been relieved once more, each changing of the guard its own small, precisely choreographed ceremony that passers-by on an ordinary day barely pause to notice. So familiar has this particular piece of London street theatre become to anyone who lives or works nearby. There is a formality to this work that sets it apart from nearly everything else happening within the building, a discipline drawn from military training rather than domestic service, and yet it shares, underneath that difference, the same essential quality that defines the work of every other person we have met today, a steady, largely unacknowledged presence that exists specifically to allow everyone else in this building to go about their business without a second thought for their own safety or the safety of the family they serve. Tonight, as the palace settles into its late hours, a guard still stands his post near the gates, another somewhere within the building's own perimeter, and their quiet, watchful presence forms one more layer of the invisible structure holding this entire strange, enormous household together, a structure built from bells and back stairs and careful hierarchy, and now, too, from the steady discipline of men trained specifically to stand watch through hours when almost everyone else in this building has finally, gratefully, been permitted to sleep. London's air, this particular week, has carried the particular heaviness that settles over the city through the colder months, coal smoke from countless thousands of chimneys mixing with the natural damp that rises off the river, and the household has its own quiet, practical relationship with this fact of city life, one that shapes small daily decisions in ways rarely discussed openly but consistently, carefully managed all the same. Windows throughout the palace's private rooms are opened and closed according to a rhythm calibrated as much by the day's particular air quality as by temperature alone, staff trained to judge, through long experience, when a room genuinely benefits from fresh air, and when the air outside is thick enough that keeping it out serves the household's health considerably better than any theoretical benefit of ventilation. The Queen herself has always held firm opinions on this particular subject, favouring fresh air within reasonable limits, a preference that occasionally puts her at gentle odds with medical advisers more inclined toward caution, though age and long habit have generally settled these small disagreements in her favour more often than not. The garden, on days when the fog lifts enough to make it genuinely pleasant, offers a welcome contrast to the thicker air closer to the city's more crowded streets, its trees and open lawn providing a small measure of relief that the household staff, moving between garden and building throughout the day, notice and appreciate in their own quiet way even when nobody upstairs specifically remarks upon it. Today's fog, thick before dawn and thinning only briefly through the middle hours before gathering again this evening, has been an entirely ordinary feature of the day, rather than anything requiring particular comment. The kind of weather this household and this city have long since learned to simply live alongside, adjusting small daily habits around it without ever expecting it to meaningfully change. The servants' hall. Once the day's more demanding work has largely finished and before everyone finally retires for the night, holds its own particular small social life, worth a moment's attention because it represents one of the few times each day when the household's staff are permitted to simply be themselves, off-duty, among each other, without the careful performance their working hours require. Tonight, after the late meal that followed the family's own dinner upstairs, a handful of staff lingered a while longer than strictly necessary in the room set aside for this purpose. Conversation drifting easily between topics, a card game started by two of the younger footmen that drew a small audience of good-natured commentary from others nearby, someone recounting a small mishap from earlier in the day, a tray nearly dropped, a moment of minor panic quickly and successfully resolved, told now with the particular exaggerated humour that turns a stressful moment, once safely past, into a genuinely funny story. This is the world Susan and Thomas and Edward all belong to in their off hours, a small, tightly bound community built from shared long days and shared exhaustion and the particular camaraderie that develops among people who understand, better than anyone outside this building ever could, exactly what each other's work actually requires. Friendships form here, and occasionally something more than friendship, romances that unfold slowly across months and years of working alongside each other, some leading eventually to marriage and a departure from service altogether, others remaining simply part of the particular texture of a life spent largely within these walls. There is a warmth to this part of the household's daily rhythm that rarely makes its way into any formal account of palace life, considerably removed from the grandeur and formality of the rooms these same people spend their working hours attending to, and yet it represents something genuinely important to how this entire household actually functions. A staff that works this hard, this precisely, this invisibly, sustained in part by the simple, ordinary human comfort of shared company at the end of a long day, laughter around a card table, a story told and retold until it becomes, in its own small way, part of the household's own private, unrecorded history. Standing back from all of this daily human activity for a moment, it is worth considering the building itself, because the palace's own long history shapes, in quiet ways, nearly everything that happens inside it, even on a day as ordinary as this one. The structure has grown and changed considerably over the generations since it first became the family's London residence. Wings added, facades reworked, the building's overall footprint expanding gradually to accommodate the growing needs of a royal household whose ceremonial and domestic requirements have never stopped evolving. Walking its exterior in daylight, as countless visitors and curious onlookers do every week, reveals a facade of pale stone that has weathered London's notoriously harsh air with the particular patience of a building that has simply learnt, over the decades, to accept the city's coal smoke and damp as an unavoidable cost of standing exactly where it stands. Tall windows mark the staterooms along the building's grander frontage, while other, smaller windows, easy to overlook amid the more imposing architecture surrounding them, mark the more modest rooms where the household's actual daily domestic life unfolds. The railings and the forecourt beyond them have become, over the years, something close to a fixed piece of London's own civic identity, a place where residents and visitors alike gather in loose, informal crowds, hoping for even the smallest glimpse of royal life, an interest that shows no sign of diminishing, even though most of what they might hope to see remains, on any given ordinary day, entirely hidden from view behind those same pale stone walls. Inside, the building's layout reflects generations of accumulated decisions, rooms repurposed, corridors added, the whole structure gradually shaped and reshaped to serve needs that have never remained entirely static across the decades it has stood in its current form. This is not, in other words, a building frozen at some single moment of completion, but one that continues, in its own slow architectural way, to grow and adapt right alongside the household living within it, much the way the gradual introduction of electric lighting alongside older gas fittings represents, on a smaller scale, the same continuous process of careful, considered change playing out across nearly every part of this remarkable, enormous, endlessly complicated home. It is worth being honest, for a moment, about what a life like Susan's or Thomas's actually costs and actually pays, because the warmth of the servants' hall and the quiet satisfaction of work done well should not obscure the genuinely demanding terms under which this entire household's daily comfort is produced. Wages for household staff at this level, while considerably better than what most domestic positions elsewhere in the country might offer, remain modest set against the enormous responsibility and enormous hours the work actually demands. A housemaid in Susan's position earns enough to send meaningful support home to family while retaining a small amount for her own needs, but the hours she works, beginning before 5 most mornings and rarely finishing before 9 at night, leave remarkably little time for anything beyond the work itself and the brief, precious hours of rest between one working day and the next. A single free afternoon each week, and perhaps a half-day beyond that, represents the entirety of her personal time, carefully rationed against a schedule that otherwise belongs almost completely to the household she serves. There is a bargain embedded in this arrangement that both sides, staff and household alike, generally accept as simply the natural shape of things, though it is worth noticing, at least for a moment, how thoroughly one-sided that bargain actually runs. Room and board are provided, a genuine benefit by the standards of the era, food and shelter, and a measure of security considerably more reliable than what many working people elsewhere in London could count on. Position within a household as prestigious as this one carries its own value too, a stepping stone toward better positions later, a name that opens doors, a training in exacting standards that will serve someone like Susan well for the rest of her working life, regardless of where that life eventually takes her. But the exhaustion is real and constant and rarely acknowledged by anyone above stairs who benefits from it without ever needing to think about its cost. Susan's hands show early signs of the wear this kind of work produces over years, small permanent roughness that no amount of care fully reverses. Thomas's feet ache most evenings in ways he has simply learnt to work around rather than expect any relief from. This is the actual texture underneath the smooth, effortless surface the household presents to its guests each evening. Real bodies, real fatigue, real years of a person's single limited life spent almost entirely in service to comfort that will never, in the ordinary course of things, be extended back toward them in equal measure. Newspapers arrive at the palace each morning through their own small established routine, delivered early enough that they sit, folded and waiting, beside the Queen's breakfast tray along with the rest of the morning's correspondence, and her engagement with them today, as most days, was considerably more attentive than a purely ceremonial reading would require. She reads with a particular close attention of someone who has spent decades learning to separate the genuinely significant from the merely sensational, skimming past certain kinds of coverage entirely, while pausing, sometimes for several minutes at a stretch, over reports touching on matters she considers genuinely important, foreign affairs, parliamentary business, occasionally a piece of writing or a review that catches her interest for reasons entirely separate from matters of state. Her opinions on what she reads are rarely kept entirely to herself, small comments made aloud to whoever happens to be nearby, questions raised later in conversation with ministers or family members that reveal, unmistakably, exactly how closely she has actually been following whatever subject happens to be under discussion. This morning's papers carried, among their usual mixture of domestic and foreign news, a report on matters in one of the more distant territories under the country's administration, and she read it with the particular focused attention such reports generally receive from her, aware, as she has been for the entirety of her long reign, that the ink and paper in front of her represent, however imperfectly, real decisions affecting real lives in places she will in all likelihood never personally visit. This awareness has never fully left her, decades into a role that could easily, in a less conscientious person, have hardened into pure abstraction, numbers and territories and reports, processed without any real sense of the human weight behind them. By the time breakfast concluded and the day's more pressing business began drawing her attention elsewhere, the newspapers had been set aside, not discarded but simply moved to a small pile that would, later, be reviewed again if any particular item warranted further follow-up. One more small, steady thread woven into a morning already carrying considerably more threads than most people outside this building would ever imagine a single breakfast hour could hold. There is a small, quiet part of most days in this household that we have not yet visited. A short period, usually in the early evening, before the more social business of dinner begins, when the Queen withdraws briefly and entirely alone into a small private space set aside for prayer. It is not an elaborate room, simple in its furnishing compared to nearly everything else in this building. A single comfortable chair, a small table holding a well-worn prayer book, a window that on clear evenings admits the last of the day's fading light. She sits here for a short while most days, rarely more than 15 or 20 minutes, and whatever passes through her mind during this time remains, as it should, entirely her own, unwitnessed by any of the attendants who otherwise fill nearly every other hour of her day with their careful, constant presence. This small window of solitude occupies a curious position within a life that is otherwise almost never genuinely private. A woman surrounded, from the moment Mrs. Ainsley enters her bedroom each morning until the moment the same woman withdraws again each night, by attendants and secretaries and family and staff, every hour accounted for, every need anticipated before it is even fully formed. Here, briefly, none of that applies. The door is closed. The room is quiet. Whatever burdens the day has carried, the dispatch boxes and the correspondence, and the careful diplomatic performance of an audience or a dinner, are set down, for a short while entirely. She emerges from this room each evening, much as she entered it, outwardly unchanged, the same composed bearing, the same steady presence that will carry her through whatever the rest of the evening requires. But there is, in the small interval between her entering that quiet room and leaving it again, something that belongs to no one else in this entire vast household. Not Mrs. Ainsley, not her children, not the government ministers whose business fills so many of her waking hours. A small, entirely private space that this remarkable, demanding, endlessly public life has somehow managed to preserve for her, unchanged, across every single day of a reign now stretching back further than most of the people currently serving her have been alive to witness. Occasionally, in the quieter hours of an ordinary evening like this one, a member of the household's older staff will recall, if asked, some larger ceremonial occasion from years past, and these memories, scattered and informal as they are, carry their own particular weight within the household's unofficial, unwritten history. One senior footman, considerably older than Thomas and nearing the end of a long career in service, remembers a great procession through London's streets some years ago. Crowds gathered so thick along the route that the carriages could barely maintain their planned pace. The sheer volume of noise from thousands of voices at once, something he has never entirely found adequate words to describe to anyone who was not there to hear it themselves. He remembers, too, the weeks of preparation that occasion demanded, considerably more than today's small scramble around an early arriving guest, uniforms checked and rechecked, routes planned and replanned, an entire household's ordinary rhythm suspended and reorganized around a single enormous public occasion that would, in the end, last only a few hours yet require months of careful advance work to execute correctly. These larger occasions punctuate the household's history the way major holidays punctuate an ordinary family's calendar, rare enough to remain vivid in memory for years afterward, demanding enough that everyone who lived through them carries some particular story of their own small part in making the day succeed. They stand in sharp contrast to the quieter, steadier rhythm of an ordinary day like today, and yet they depend, in the end, on exactly the same underlying skills this household exercises constantly, the same careful hierarchy, the same practiced invisible labour, simply scaled up to a size that makes today's small adjustment to a carriage schedule look, by comparison, almost trivially modest. Listening to a story like this one, told quietly by an older member of staff during a rare unhurried moment, offers a particular kind of perspective on the household's daily life that the day's own ordinary business rarely provides on its own, a reminder that this building and the people who keep it running have witnessed, across the decades, occasions of considerably greater scale and significance than anything happening within these walls tonight, and have met each of them, in their turn, with the same steady, practiced competence that carried today's smaller, quieter version of exactly the same underlying work. The youngest member of the kitchen staff, a scullery maid barely 14 years old, has spent today much as she spends most days, occupying the lowest rung of a hierarchy, so detailed that even within the kitchens themselves, considerable distinctions separate her position from that of the more senior kitchen maids working alongside her. Her work today has consisted largely of the least glamorous tasks the kitchen requires, scrubbing pots and pans in water that grows cooler and greasier with each use before finally being changed, carrying vegetables from the storerooms, fetching and carrying whatever the more senior staff need at any given moment, work that leaves her hands red and chapped by the end of most days, and that offers, at this early stage of her career, very little of the satisfaction that Mrs. Whitfield or even a more experienced kitchen maid might describe when discussing their own work. And yet she is, in her own quiet way, genuinely proud to hold even this modest position, having come to it through a family connection much like Edward's, a mother who once worked in a smaller household kitchen and who pushed hard, with whatever limited influence she had, to secure her daughter a start in a household as prestigious as this one. The girl understands, with a clarity that occasionally surprises the older staff around her, that today's exhausting, unglamorous work represents the first rung of a ladder that Mrs. Whitfield herself once stood at the bottom of, decades ago, in a kitchen not unlike this one, and there is something in that understanding that carries her through the longer, harder days with a patience considerably beyond what her age would ordinarily suggest. She will finish tonight later than nearly anyone else in the building beyond the most senior kitchen staff. The last of the pots finally scrubbed clean and stacked, the last of the vegetable peelings cleared away, and she will make her way to a small shared room considerably plainer even than Susan's, exhausted in the particular complete way that only genuine physical labour produces, and she will sleep, tonight, the deep dreamless sleep of someone young enough and tired enough that even the strangest, grandest building in the country holds no power at all to keep her awake a single moment longer than her body requires. Buckingham Palace, for all its prominence in the public imagination, represents only one residence among several that this household maintains and moves between across the turning of a year, and the administrative thread connecting these different homes runs, quietly, through nearly every day spent at any one of them. Correspondence today included, among its many other threads, several notes concerning arrangements at another of the family's residences, staff and household matters requiring coordination across properties separated by considerable distance, a household steward at one location writing to confirm details with an office here in London, a question about a planned future visit requiring advance preparation, not unlike the preparation Susan and the rest of the household staff undertook today for a guest arriving merely hours ahead of schedule, except multiplied across weeks rather than compressed into a single afternoon. This ongoing coordination between residences represents its own particular kind of administrative skill, an entire small department of the household's operation devoted specifically to managing the logistics of a family whose life moves, across the calendar year, between several substantial properties, each with its own staff, its own particular character, its own long-accumulated traditions and preferences that must be honoured and maintained even during the months when the family itself is elsewhere. Furniture and belongings sometimes travel between residences ahead of a planned visit, letters and instructions crossing back and forth for weeks in advance to ensure that whichever house the family arrives at next will be ready to receive them with exactly the same seamless, effortless comfort that Buckingham Palace itself maintains on an ordinary day like today. There is a kind of vast, quiet orchestration happening across this entire extended household, considerably larger in scope than anything visible within these particular walls tonight. Dozens of staff at other properties going about their own version of today's careful, invisible work, all of it ultimately coordinated toward the same underlying purpose that has shaped every hour we have followed today inside this particular building, ensuring that wherever this family happens to be, whenever they happen to arrive there, the enormous effort required to make their life comfortable will remain, as it always has, entirely, carefully, invisible. There is one more small detail worth sitting with before the night closes over this building entirely, a detail easy to overlook amid everything else that filled today, and yet somehow representative of the whole of it. Somewhere around midday, in the brief lull between the morning's audience and the afternoon's sudden reshuffling around the early guest, a housemaid paused for perhaps 30 seconds beside a window on the second floor, a rare unscheduled moment of simple stillness in a day otherwise packed edge to edge with careful, necessary motion. She was carrying a stack of freshly pressed linen at the time, on her way from one task to the next, and something about the particular quality of light falling through that window just then, pale and grey and softened by the morning's lingering fog, caught her attention long enough to make her stop. She did not linger more than half a minute. There was too much still to do, and she knew it, the way everyone in this building always knows it. Some fresh task always waiting only a few steps further along whatever corridor they happen to be walking. But for that half minute, she simply stood, linen balanced in her arms, watching London's grey rooftops stretch away beyond the garden wall, watching a single bird cross the narrow strip of sky visible from that particular window, and then, just as quietly as she had stopped, she continued on, disappearing back into the day's steady, unbroken rhythm of small necessary tasks. Nobody saw this happen. Nobody recorded it. It will not appear in any account of this particular day beyond the one we have just given it, and by tomorrow the housemaid herself will likely have forgotten it entirely, one small unremarkable moment lost among the hundreds of small unremarkable moments that fill any working day of this kind. And yet it happened, this morning, in this building, a single quiet human pause inside a day built almost entirely from motion, and there is something in that small, forgotten stillness that captures, better than almost anything else we have witnessed tonight, the actual truth of what this palace really is underneath its famous stone face. Not simply a machine for producing effortless royal comfort, though it is unmistakably that, but also somewhere inside all of that careful, invisible labour, simply a place where ordinary people, doing extraordinary amounts of quiet work, occasionally paused for half a minute beside a window to watch the light change, before returning, as they always eventually did, to whatever task still waited for them further down the hall. Consider, too, how differently this same building will feel again, in only a handful of hours, once morning properly arrives, and the entire quiet machinery we have followed today begins turning itself over once more. Susan will wake before 5, as she always does, and somewhere below her a range will already be drawing back up toward its working heat, and a fire in a bedroom, not unlike the Queen's own, will already be receiving its first careful attention of the new day. The cycle does not really stop tonight so much as it simply pauses briefly, the way a held breath pauses before releasing again, and everyone sleeping now within these walls, from the youngest scullery maid to the Queen herself, will wake tomorrow into some new version of exactly the careful, coordinated day we have just spent together, different in its particular details, identical in its underlying shape, one more ordinary day inside one extraordinary building, waiting, as it always does, just beyond the edge of the present darkness. It is worth taking a moment, before we return to the quiet hours of tonight, to think about how a day like this one shifts and changes across the turning of a year, because the version we have been following tonight, a grey, cool morning fading into fog, is really only one possible version of a rhythm that repeats itself, with small but meaningful variations, across every season this household experiences. In the depths of winter, the whole enormous machinery of keeping this building warm strains considerably harder than it does tonight, fires needing feeding more frequently, coal consumption climbing steeply, staff moving through corridors bundled against a cold that no amount of careful heating ever entirely banishes from a building this size and this old. The days themselves grow short enough that lamps are lit absurdly early in the afternoon, and the household's rhythm compresses itself around daylight that barely seems to arrive before it begins retreating again, a constant low-grade battle against darkness that shapes nearly every practical decision from breakfast through to the final closing of curtains each evening. Summer brings its own entirely different set of demands. The kitchens, already hot from their ordinary work, become considerably more oppressive when the weather outside refuses to cooperate, and the enormous ranges that provide such welcome warmth in January become in July something closer to a genuine hardship for the staff working closest to them. The garden, meanwhile, comes fully into its own during these warmer months, and the Queen, when her schedule allows it, spends considerably more time walking its paths than she ever manages during the colder seasons, a small private pleasure that the household staff responsible for the garden's upkeep take particular quiet pride in providing for her. Spring and autumn each carry their own particular character too, spring bringing a certain lightness to the entire household as the days lengthen and the garden begins its slow annual transformation, autumn bringing the first hints of the coal smoke and fog that will define London through the coming winter months, a gradual thickening of the air outside the palace walls that staff moving between buildings notice long before anyone comfortably settled indoors thinks to mention it. Certain occasions punctuate this yearly cycle with considerably more weight than an ordinary evening's family dinner, state occasions requiring weeks of preparation rather than a single scrambled afternoon, formal receptions drawing crowds and processions through London streets, occasions when the entire household's careful, invisible machinery must scale up to a size that makes tonight's small adjustment to a carriage schedule look, by comparison, almost trivially simple. Walter has driven through those grander occasions more times than he could easily count across his 3 decades of service, and Mrs. Whitfield has produced meals for gatherings considerably larger and considerably more formally demanding than tonight's family dinner, and both of them, along with every other senior member of this household staff, carry within them a kind of institutional memory that no single document could ever fully capture, an accumulated, embodied understanding of exactly what this building requires of the people who keep it running, season after season, year after year, occasion after occasion, for as long as any of them can remember, and considerably longer than that. Tonight was, by these larger standards, a small day, a family dinner, a guest arriving somewhat earlier than planned, and yet even this small day required the careful, coordinated effort of dozens of people working in close, largely silent cooperation with each other, each one holding their own particular piece of the day's success, none of them individually responsible for the whole of it, all of them together making up something that no single person, not even the Queen herself, could have produced alone. It is well past midnight now, and outside the palace gates, London has settled into the particular thin, quiet hours that even a great city eventually surrenders to, though it never surrenders entirely. A constable still stands his post near the railings, a different man now than the one who stood there before dawn this morning, the watch having changed hours ago in its own small unremarked ritual, boots on wet stone, breath faintly visible in the cold night air. Fog has thickened again since the evening's carriages arrived, gathering low along the road the way it so often does at this hour, softening the gas lamps into pale diffuse halos that do more to suggest light than to actually provide it. Somewhere off toward the river, a horse and cart moves slowly along an otherwise empty street, the sound of its wheels carrying strangely far in the damp, still air, and then fading again into the particular hush that settles over this part of London, once the theatres have emptied and the last omnibuses have made their final runs of the night. From the outside, the palace itself looks now almost exactly as it looked at 4 o'clock this morning when we first arrived here, dark, composed, a handful of windows still faintly lit, the rest given over entirely to shadow. A stranger walking past at this hour, glancing up at that dark stone face, would have no real way of knowing that the building in front of them had, over the course of the last 20 hours, hosted a formal audience with a government official, prepared and served a full state-style dinner for a party of guests, adjusted an entire afternoon's careful schedule around an early arrival, and kept warm and fed and clothed and comfortable dozens of people, family and staff alike, through every one of those same 20 hours. It would simply look, to that passing stranger, like a large, dark, quiet building, exactly the way it is meant to look. Inside, though, the building has not yet entirely surrendered to sleep. A handful of staff remain at work even now, a night watchman making his slow, methodical rounds through corridors lit only by the low gas jets left burning specifically for this purpose, checking doors, checking windows, ensuring that fires banked for the night are behaving as they should and not smouldering their way towards some danger nobody would discover until it was too late. This is quiet, solitary work, considerably different in character from the busy, coordinated effort of the day, and the man performing it tonight has done this particular round often enough that he could probably find his way through every corridor in this building with his eyes closed, a small private mastery that nobody upstairs will ever think to ask him about. He passes, at one point in his rounds, near the discreet service door that connects the working corridors behind the scenes to the grand ceremonial world of the staterooms, and on a whim, or perhaps simply out of the quiet habit of a man who has walked this particular stretch of building more times than he could count, he pauses at the door and opens it and steps through. The grand staircase, lit now only by the faint gas jets left burning at each landing, holds a stillness entirely different from its morning stillness 20 hours earlier. This morning it was simply quiet, waiting, dust sheets not yet removed, the day still ahead of it. Now it is quiet in the way a room is quiet after something has happened in it and finished happening, guests having climbed and descended these same shallow steps only hours ago in evening dress, laughter and conversation briefly filling a space built specifically to hold exactly that kind of occasion, and now empty again, the glass dome overhead showing nothing but black London sky and a thin smear of fog-diffused starlight. The throne room holds its chairs in the same perfect unoccupied arrangement they held this morning, gilt surfaces catching what little light reaches them and throwing it back in small scattered points, rather than any real illumination. No one sat in these particular chairs today. They exist, most days, exactly like this, waiting for occasions considerably rarer than a family dinner, and there is something almost strange about a room this carefully, expensively maintained, standing empty this many days out of the year, cared for daily by staff who dust and polish surfaces that go unused for weeks or months at a stretch, simply so that when the room is finally needed, it will be ready. The white drawing room, the green, the blue, each one holds its own particular quality of darkness. Furniture arranged exactly as it was this morning, fires long since gone cold, the faint lingering smell of this evening's flowers still present in the air of at least one of them, a ghost of the arrangement that stood there only hours ago before being cleared away with everything else once the guests had moved on. The night watchman passes through each in turn, checking, out of long habit more than genuine expectation of finding anything wrong, that windows are properly latched, that nothing has been left burning that should not be, that all is exactly as it should be for a room that will not be properly used again until whatever the next occasion happens to be. The picture gallery stretches away into shadow in both directions, its portraits reduced by the low light to little more than pale ovals of face floating against darker backgrounds, generations of the family looking down at nothing, at an empty corridor, at a single man with a lamp walking slowly past them toward the far end of the gallery where another door waits. There is something in walking this particular corridor at this particular hour that even a watchman who has done this round hundreds of times still occasionally feels a sense of scale, of time, of standing briefly inside a very small, very late moment within something considerably larger and older than any single day's business could ever fully represent. The state dining room, when he reaches it, is perhaps the strangest of all tonight, because unlike the others it was, only a few hours ago, entirely full, alive with candlelight and conversation and the careful choreography of footmen moving between courses. Now the table stands bare again, linen removed, silver returned to its locked room, chairs pushed back into their neat, waiting formation exactly as they stood this morning, before any of tonight's dinner had even begun to take shape in the kitchens below. It is difficult, standing in this particular emptiness, to fully reconcile it with the room as it existed only hours earlier, and yet this transformation, table to bare table, occupied to empty, happens in this room with a regularity that has long since stopped feeling remarkable to anyone who works inside this building, however remarkable it might strike an outsider seeing it for the first time. The ballroom, largest and emptiest of them all, receives the briefest visit of the entire round, the watchman's lamp throwing a small moving circle of light across a floor that reflects it back faintly from its polished surface, chandeliers overhead reduced to dark, complicated shapes against the higher darkness of the ceiling. No music, no movement, nothing but the soft sound of his own footsteps crossing a space built to hold hundreds of people, and currently, at this hour, holding exactly one. The watchman completes his round and returns, eventually back through the same discreet door he came through, back into the narrower, plainer corridors that run behind and beneath the grand rooms he has just finished checking. The contrast between the two worlds, walked through within the space of perhaps 20 minutes, never entirely stops registering with him, even after years of making this same nightly circuit. On one side of that door, gilt and silk and portraits and space built specifically to overwhelm. On the other, plain plaster and gas jets and stone floors worn smooth by generations of servants' feet moving quickly along them, space built specifically to be efficient, to be unseen, to make the other side possible. Both sides belong to the same building. Both sides, in their own way, belong to the same day, a day that began before dawn with a maid carrying linen and a fire being rebuilt, and is ending now, well past midnight, with a single man carrying a lamp through empty rooms that held, only hours ago, an entire evening's worth of careful, coordinated life. Elsewhere in the building, the last handful of people still technically awake are finishing their own final small tasks before finally, gratefully, allowing themselves to sleep. A junior kitchen maid banks the last of the fires in the great range for the night, checking that the coals are settled correctly to hold their heat through until the early morning shift arrives to build them back up. Somewhere in the linen rooms, a final basket of tomorrow's fresh sheets is set out ready, so that whoever begins the day's work in a few short hours will not need to search for anything, will simply be able to begin. By 1:30, the building has settled about as fully as it ever settles, which is to say nearly, but never quite completely. There is always someone awake somewhere in Buckingham Palace, at any hour of the day or night, a fact that most of the people sleeping soundly upstairs in their comfortable beds have likely never once stopped to consider, and yet it remains true nonetheless, has remained true for as long as this building has stood, and will remain true tomorrow and the day after, and every day this household continues its long, quiet, largely invisible work of keeping itself running. A person could spend an entire career inside this building, decades of quiet, careful, invisible service, and never once be thanked directly for any single part of it. And most of the people we have met tonight have, in one way or another, made a kind of peace with exactly that arrangement, finding whatever satisfaction the work itself offers, rather than waiting on a recognition that was never really designed to arrive. It is a strange kind of trade, when you sit with it for a moment, an entire life's worth of skill and attention offered to a household that will remember, in the end, mostly its own family's names, and yet the trade was made anyway, day after day, by person after person, for reasons that were sometimes practical and sometimes something closer to genuine pride, and occasionally, if a person was honest with themselves in the quiet hour before sleep, something that resembled love for a place, however imperfect its terms, that had nonetheless become, across enough years, simply home. By 2 a.m, the last of the household staff have finally genuinely settled into sleep. Susan and her roommate lie quiet in their small shared room, the exhaustion of a day that began before 5 now fully, completely claiming them, tomorrow's version of today's same careful work still hours away. Thomas sleeps in the quarters set aside for the senior footman, the particular disciplined stillness he held for hours near the dining room door tonight finally, entirely released. Edward, his own long day of messages and escorted audiences behind him, sleeps the deep, uncomplicated sleep of someone still young enough to recover fully from even the most demanding day with a single good night's rest. Walter, down at the Mews, sleeps in quarters close enough to the stables that a restless horse could wake him in an instant, though tonight, as most nights, no such disturbance comes. Mrs. Whitfield sleeps, having already, out of long habit, run through tomorrow's rough shape of a menu one final time before finally allowing her mind to quiet. Mrs. Ainsley sleeps in her own small room, the particular satisfaction of a difficult day handled well, settling over her rest the way it does most nights after a day that has tested her skill and found it entirely equal to the task. Upstairs, in the room finished in such a hurry this afternoon, The guest sleeps too, warm and comfortable, entirely unaware of the small quiet scramble that made her comfort possible, dreaming, perhaps, of nothing more complicated than the pleasant conversation and good food of an evening well spent among family. And in her own private apartment, in a bed with good linens and a fire banked low and steady in the grate, surrounded by photographs holding their silent nightly watch over a room they have watched over for years, the Queen sleeps as well, her day's dispatch boxes and correspondence and careful diplomatic audience and warm family dinner and delighted imperfect piano performance all folded now into whatever rest a woman in her 70s, carrying the accumulated weight of decades on a throne, allows herself at the end of an ordinary working day. Below and around all of them, the building itself continues its quiet, never quite complete settling towards stillness. The dining room stands empty now, silver returned and counted, china washed and stacked, linen gathered for tomorrow's laundry. The kitchens hold their low overnight burn, ranges banked rather than fully extinguished, ready to be built back up again within a few short hours by hands that will begin this entire cycle over almost before the current one has properly finished. The staterooms, visited already tonight by a single watchman carrying a single lamp, stand dark and silent and magnificently empty, chandeliers reduced to complicated dark shapes against higher darkness, portraits dissolved into shadow, gilt surfaces holding no light at all to reflect. Beyond the discreet door that separates this working world from the ceremonial one, the throne room waits in its permanent, patient readiness for an occasion still weeks or months away. The picture gallery holds its long, silent rows of painted faces, watching nothing, watching everyone, watching the particular darkness that settles over this building every single night, regardless of whatever grandeur filled its rooms only hours earlier. The ballroom stands vast and empty and entirely without music, floor gleaming faintly in whatever thin light finds its way through curtained windows from the gas lamps still burning along the street outside. And outside those windows, London continues exactly as it has continued through every single hour of this long day, indifferent mostly to whatever happened behind the palace's dark stone face. A constable still walking his slow rounds along the railings, fog gathering and thinning, and gathering again over streets that will, in a few short hours, begin filling once more with the ordinary daily traffic of a great city going about its business. A passer-by glancing up at the palace right now would see exactly what a passer-by would have seen at 4 o'clock this same morning, a dark, composed, silent building, giving no hint at all of the extraordinary volume of careful, coordinated, deeply human effort that filled every single hour standing between then and now. That in the end is the actual, quiet truth hidden behind the famous stone face so many thousands of people walk past every single day without ever fully considering it. Buckingham Palace's real achievement was never simply its size, or its history, or the ceremony it houses on its grandest occasions. It was this instead, repeated every single day without exception, a building woken before dawn by dozens of careful hands, dressed and fed and corresponded on behalf of, received its visitors and adjusted its schedules, and served its dinners and lit its candles and answered its bells, and then, every single night, folded itself quietly back down into darkness, ready to begin the entire remarkable, invisible cycle again the moment morning came. The fire in the Queen's bedroom burns low and steady through the last hours of the night. The clocks continue their patient ticking throughout the building, each one still perfectly matched to every other, exactly as the household's careful daily maintenance ensures they always are, and somewhere beyond the gates, the first hint of the coming morning has not yet arrived, though it is, even now, already on its way, already gathering itself somewhere beyond the eastern edge of the city, ready to begin, in a few short hours, the whole quiet, extraordinary machinery of this palace turning itself over once again.